Somewhere around 3,000 years ago, on a night when the monsoon had not yet broken and the air sat thick as a held breath over the Gangetic plains, a priest knelt before a fire and spoke a name that was not quite a name. He spoke it carefully. He spoke it the way a man speaks to something he cannot see, but knows is listening. The word left his mouth and rose with the smoke into a sky bruised with stormlight, and what he called out to was not a protector, not a father, not a king seated on a celestial throne dispensing justice. What he called out to was terror itself. What he called out to was the howl. The name was Rudra. And that name, old even then, older perhaps than the language that carried it, is the first thread in a story that would become one of the longest continuously told in human history. It is the story of a god who begins at the edge of everything, ordered, everything safe, everything known. A god who is not invited to the sacrifice but who must be appeased nonetheless. A god whose arrows fly unseen and bring fever, bring madness, bring the sudden death of cattle in the night. A god who is, in the earliest hymns we have, both the wound and the only one who can heal it. This is not the Shiva of temple spires and holy cities. Not yet. That god, the ash-smeared yogi, the cosmic dancer, the husband of Parvati, the father of Ganesha, is still centuries away, still waiting to be assembled from fragments of belief scattered across a subcontinent. What we have here, in these storm-racked verses of the Rigveda, is something raw. Something that smells of rain on dust and blood on stone. Something that the people who first sang of it did not love so much as fear, and did not worship so much as try, desperately to survive. Listen. The Rigveda is a collection of over 1,000 hymns, composed in an archaic form of Sanskrit sometime between 1500 and 1200 BCE by a people who called themselves the Arya, a word that meant something like noble or civilized, and that marked them out, in their own minds, from the darker, stranger peoples whose lands they were entering. These were pastoral nomads, cattle herders and horse riders, and their religion was a religion of fire. They built no temples, they carved no idols. What they did was burn offerings of ghee and grain and the fat of animals, burn them on altars built fresh for each rite, burn them so the smoke would rise to the gods who lived in the bright sky, and who, in return for these fragrant meals, would send rain for the crops, victory in battle, sons to carry the family name. The gods they loved were gods of light and order. Indra, king of the heavens, wielder of the thunderbolt, slayer of the demon Vritra who had held back the waters, Agni, the sacred fire himself, the priest among gods, the mouth through which all offerings passed, Varuna, guardian of cosmic law, who saw every transgression and bound the guilty with his noose, Surya, the sun, riding his chariot across the sky, Ushas, the dawn, praised in some of the most beautiful poetry the ancient world produced. These were the gods of the day. These were the gods you wanted at your side. But there was another. Of the 1,028 hymns in the Rigveda Samhita, only 4, comprising 39 verses, are dedicated to Rudra. This is a deity who appears, statistically, as a minor figure, a footnote, a god who receives less attention than the divine drink soma, less attention than the abstract principle of speech, far less attention than the great Indra who bestrides the Vedic pantheon like a colossus. And yet those 4 hymns carry a charge that is absent from almost everything else in the collection. They are not triumphant, they are not celebratory, they are pleading. Hymn 1:114 opens not with praise but with prayer. May we not provoke the fury of Rudra. The poet does not ask for blessings, he asks to be spared. He addresses Rudra the way you might address a tiger you have stumbled upon in the forest, with a voice kept carefully low, with an offer of whatever you have in your hands, with the desperate hope that if you say the right words, in the right tone, the great and terrible thing before you will turn aside and let you live another day. The name itself tells you what you need to know. Rudra derives from the Sanskrit root rud, syas, which means to roar or to howl. He is the howler, the wild one, the god whose voice is the voice of the storm wind tearing through trees, the voice of the dying man crying out in the night, the voice of whatever it is that makes the hair stand up on the back of your neck when you're alone in a dark place and you hear something moving. Later traditions will offer gentler etymologies, he who drives away sorrow, he who makes one weep with devotion, but the Vedic poets knew what they were dealing with. They called him Ghora, terrifying. They likened him to a wild beast. They approached him not with the confident swagger of a worshippers addressing their patron, but with what one scholar has called a cringing fear, the desire to avert wrath and curry favour. And favour there was, if you were lucky, if you said the right words, if Rudra chose, in his inscrutability, to show his other face. Because Rudra, alone among the early Vedic gods, is explicitly described as having two natures. Hymn 10.9.2 of the Rigveda states it plainly. The deity has one aspect that is wild and cruel, Rudra, and another that is kind and tranquil, Shiva. That second word, Shiva, means auspicious. It means blessed. It means, in the most literal sense, good. And here is the first great paradox at the heart of this story. The most terrifying god in the Vedic pantheon is also the one most often addressed as the auspicious one. Not because he was kind, not because he was gentle, because the people who prayed to him hoped, through flattery, through careful linguistic magic, to awaken his better nature and put his worse one to sleep. This is not hypocrisy. This is survival. Think of it this way. You are a herder on the edge of the known world 3 millennia ago, in a landscape where the monsoon can fail and bring famine, where a fever can sweep through your family and leave you bearing your children, where the wilderness beyond your village fires is home to things that would eat you if they could. You know that the universe is full of forces you cannot control. You know that death comes without warning and often without reason. And you know, because you have seen it happen, because your grandfather told you stories, because the evidence is everywhere, that the same power that destroys can also, sometimes inexplicably, heal. Rudra is that power. His arrows, say the hymns, are brilliant shafts that run about heaven and earth like lightning. They bring disease, they bring misfortune, they bring the sudden collapse of everything you thought was stable. But the same Rudra who fires those arrows is also possessed of 1,000 medicines. Hymn 143 calls him healer. Hymn 746 begs him to be gracious and to grant remedies for illness. The logic is not complicated. If he is the one who wounds, then he is the only one who can withdraw the wound. If his arrows have pierced your cattle, your children, your own shaking body, then only his hand can pull them out again. This is the theology of the abyss. This is the worship of what cannot be tamed. The Vedic religion, as a whole, was obsessed with order. The word for cosmic law was rti, and it governed everything. The rising of the sun, the falling of the rain, the proper sequence of rituals, the hierarchy of gods and men. The great Indra was a champion of Dharta. He had slain the chaos serpent Vritra and released the waters. He had established the boundaries between the human world and the demonic. Agni was the reliable messenger, carrying offerings upward in a prescribed manner. Varuna watched for transgressions against the cosmic order and punished them with mathematical precision. The whole system was, in essence, a system of contracts. You give the gods what they want, and they give you what you need. Rudra does not fit. He is not part of the central Vedic sacrifice in the way Indra and Agni are. The hymns themselves seem aware of his outsider status. He's associated not with the cultivated lands and the village hearth, but with the mountains, the forests, the wild places where the rules of civilization do not reach. He is called Lord of Cattle, Pashupati, but the cattle he rules are not the domesticated herds of the settled community. They are the beasts of the unclaimed world, the animals that belong to no one and answer to no human call. He is a hunter, an archer, and what he hunts is not always clear. Sometimes it seems to be demons, sometimes it seems to be disease, sometimes the hymns suggest with a shudder, it might be us. And yet, and this is crucial, the Vedic poets could not ignore him. They could not simply leave him out of the ritual system and hope he went away. Because the things he represented, storm, sickness, death, the uncontrollable chaos at the edges of life, were not things that went away. They were always there, pressing against the boundaries of the order, waiting. And if you did not propitiate the god who embodied those things, if you did not offer him his share, if you did not speak his name with the proper fear and the proper flattery, then he might notice you. Then he might turn his attention your way. So they prayed. The prayers are extraordinary. They are nothing like the confident hymns to Indra, which sound almost like a warrior's boast, or the stately addresses to Varuna, which have the cadence of a legal petition. The prayers to Rudra are urgent, nervous, almost fawning. Be kind to us, Rudra, they say. Do not be angry with us. Do not attack our great or small, our growing or full grown, our father or mother. Do not hurt the bodies dear to us. The list of potential victims, children, parents, the young, the old, is an acknowledgement that Rudra's arrows do not discriminate. He is not a god of justice. He does not punish the wicked and spare the righteous. He is the thunderstorm, and the thunderstorm does not care where you stand. Yet the same hymn that lists these terrors also calls him beautiful. It praises his brown skin and his blue-black throat. It describes him as shining like the sun, as golden, as adorned with all ornaments. This is not contradiction. It is awe. The poets saw in Rudra something that was beyond the categories of good and evil, something that was terrifying precisely because it was powerful, and powerful precisely because it was not bound by the rules that bound everything else. He was the god who proved that the universe was larger than human understanding. He was the proof that order, however beloved, was not all there was. And so the word Shiva, auspicious, blessed, good, became a kind of talisman, a charm, a name you spoke to call forth the kindness and keep the terror at bay. It was not a lie exactly. Rudra really did have a benevolent aspect. The hymns are clear about his healing powers, his capacity to grant life as well as death. But it was also not quite the truth. The word Shiva was a wish. It was an attempt to transform the wild god into something safer, something that could be approached without trembling. It did not work. It was never going to work. But it planted a seed, a name, a possibility, an association between this howling archer of the storm and the idea of blessedness that would over the next several centuries grow into something the Vedic poets could never have imagined. But that is later. That is the story of synthesis, of transformation, of a god who absorbs other gods and becomes something new. For now, in the stark and ancient world of the early Rigveda, there is only Rudra. There is only the howl. There is only the desperate question that hangs over every hymn addressed to him. Who worships a god they are afraid of? And the answer, of course, is everyone who understands what fear is for. The Stormwind Sons came screaming across the sky. The Maruts, Rudra's children, Rudra's army, were a band of young warriors who rode the winds of the monsoon. They were beautiful and terrible, armed with lightning, armoured in gold, their chariots pulled by deer or by the storm itself. The Rigveda speaks of them with a kind of horrified admiration, the way you might speak of a flood that destroys your fields but also brings the water your crops need to survive. They were the sound of thunder. They were the flash that splits the darkness. They were the voice of their father, multiplied and let loose upon the world. In Rigveda 2.33.1 the text is explicit. Rudra is the father of the Marutganas, the host of Maruts. This is significant for several reasons. First, it means that Rudra is not merely a solitary figure prowling the edges of the divine world. He has a following, a family, a domain. The storm is not one entity but many, and they all answer to him. Second, it places Rudra's power at the centre of one of the most important natural phenomena in the Indian subcontinent, the monsoon. The rains that come sweeping up from the sea each summer, bringing either prosperity or devastation depending on their timing and intensity, are his children. They belong to him. And third, it tells us something about what kind of father this god is. The Maruts are not gentle. They are not tame. They shatter mountains. They make the earth tremble. They inspire fear even in the other gods. And yet they are also praised, in hymn after hymn, for their beauty, their splendour, their vital energy. They are young men at the peak of their strength, and they serve a father who is, himself, the embodiment of untamed force. Rudra's connection to the mountains is equally deep. In the later hymns of the Yajurveda, in the Shatarudriya, the litany of 100 names, he is described explicitly as dwelling in the high places, in the crags and peaks where the air is thin and the land belongs to no human community. This is not metaphor. The mountains, in the Vedic imagination, were the edge of the known world. They were where the rules ended. They were populated by spirits, by dangers, by powers that did not answer to the great gods of the sacrifice. And Rudra was lord there. The Sri Rudram, taken from the Krishna Yajurveda's Taittiriya Samhita, gives us the fullest picture of who this god was becoming, and who he had perhaps always been beneath the surface of the earlier hymns. The Namakam, the first section, is a catalogue of epithets, and each one is a door opening onto a different aspect of the divine terror. He is Nilakantha, blue-throated. This epithet, so famous in later mythology, already appears here, attached to a deity whose throat is the colour of poison, or the colour of the storm-dark sky. The stories of how it got that way will come later, in the Puranic age. Here it is simply a fact, a mark upon the god's body that sets him apart. He is Sahasraksha, thousand-eyed. He sees everything. He misses nothing. You cannot hide from a god who has 1,000 eyes, and you cannot know what he is looking for when he looks at you. And he is Pasupati, Lord of Beasts. This title, more than any other, will follow Rudra across the centuries and into his transformation into Shiva. It links him to the animals of the wild, to the creatures that exist outside human control, to everything that lives and dies without reference to human law or human desire. But it also, in later readings, links him to all creatures, to humanity itself as a kind of herd, watched over by a shepherd who is not always kind and not always cruel, but is always, always watching. The Ayurveda's description of Rudra adds physical details that deepen the sense of awe. He's thousand-eyed, as we have said. He is also blue-necked and described as dwelling on the mountains as his home. He is the lord of cattle. He is the lord of servants and of the poor. He is a healing force who prevents disease and causes happiness. And he is still, always, the one whose arrows you pray he will not fire. This is the Rudra of the late Vedic period, no longer quite the minor atmospheric deity of the earliest hymns, but not yet the supreme god of the later Shiva traditions. He is growing, he is accumulating. Each new epithet, each new association, each new story told about him in the ritual texts adds another layer to his being, and the priests who sang his praises were beginning to sense, perhaps, that they were dealing with something larger than they had originally understood. The tension at the heart of Rudra's character, the fact that he is both feared and needed, both destroyer and healer, both outcast and essential, is not a contradiction to be resolved. It is the point. The Vedic worldview was built on the idea of order, of virtus, of cosmic law that held everything in its proper place. But the priests who maintained that worldview were not naive. They knew that order was fragile. They knew that the rains could fail, that the cattle could sicken, that the enemy could come over the hill and burn everything you loved. They knew that the universe contained forces that did not care about their sacrifices, their hymns, their carefully maintained fires. Rudra was their acknowledgement of that truth. He was the god-shaped hole in their system, the place where they admitted that some things could not be bargained with, only appeased. He belonged to no community, and yet every community needed him, because every community lived in fear of the things he represented. He received no share of the great sacrifices, and yet he had to be addressed, had to be propitiated, or else he might turn his terrible attention toward those who had ignored him. He was, in the deepest sense, the god of the edge, the god of the place where the firelight stops and the darkness begins, the god who reminds you that you are small, that the world is large, and that there are things in it older and more powerful than any human understanding. And as the centuries passed, as the Vedic age gave way to something new, as the people of the subcontinent mingled and merged and exchanged their gods like traders exchanging goods, this edge god began to move toward the centre. The seal was small, barely 2 inches square, and it had been buried in the earth for more than 4,000 years when the excavators at Mohenjo-Daro found it in 928. Mohenjo-Daro was one of the great cities of the Indus Valley civilization, a culture that flourished between roughly 2600 and 1900 BCE in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India. These were urban people, builders of planned cities with advanced drainage systems and standardized bricks, traders who sent their goods as far as Mesopotamia, users of a script that remains to this day undeciphered. They left behind no readable texts, no named kings, no clear mythologies. What they left behind were objects, pottery and tools, jewellery and weights, and thousands of small seals carved with images and symbols that may have been writing or may have been something else entirely. And among those seals one stood out. It depicted a figure seated in a posture that would later be called yogic. Knees bent, legs crossed, spine erect. The figure had 3 faces, or possibly one face with 2 profiles flanking it. On its head were what appeared to be horns, the horns of a buffalo sweeping and curved. Around it, arranged with careful symmetry, were animals: an elephant, a tiger, a buffalo, a rhinoceros, and 2 deer. The figure sat on a low platform or throne, its arms held in a particular way that some have interpreted as meditative. Sir John Marshall, who oversaw the Mohenjo-Daro excavations, looked at this image and saw something he recognized: the yogic posture, the animals gathered around like supplicants or companions, the horned headdress, the 3 faces. He called it the Pashupati seal, and he proposed that it depicted a prototype of Shiva. Specifically Shiva in his aspect as Lord of the Animals, the same Pasupati whose name appears in the Yajurveda more than 1,000 years later. This interpretation has been debated ever since. Some scholars have embraced it, seeing in the Pashupati seal evidence that Shiva's worship, or the worship of a deity who would eventually become Shiva, stretches back to the very dawn of Indian civilization, before the arrival of the Sanskrit-speaking peoples who composed the Vedas, before the religion of fire and sacrifice, before everything we think of as Vedic culture. If Marshall was right, then the god who appears as a minor and terrifying figure in the Rigveda was not new to the subcontinent at all. He was already there, already ancient, already the lord of beasts and the master of the yogic trance. Other scholars have been more skeptical. The seal is small, its details are ambiguous. What look like horns might be an elaborate headdress of a different kind. What looks like 3 faces might be something else entirely. The figure might not be seated in meditation, but in some other posture meaningful only within the lost context of Indus Valley culture. And even if it does depict a lord of animals, a 3-faced god, a yogic figure on a throne, that does not necessarily mean it is connected to the Shiva of later Hinduism. Cultures can develop similar images independently. Gods can resemble each other without being the same. The truth is that we do not know. We cannot read the Indus script. We cannot hear the prayers of the people who carved that seal. We cannot ask them what they meant or who they worshipped. The Pashupati seal remains a mystery, a tantalizing suggestion, a possibility that cannot be confirmed and cannot quite be dismissed. What we can say with certainty is this: when the Vedic age gave way to the post-Vedic, when the religion of fire sacrifice began to transform into the religion of temples and devotion that we call Hinduism, the god Rudra transformed with it, and the new god who emerged from that transformation bore striking resemblances to the figure on the Mohenjo-Daro seal, a lord of animals, a master of the yogic posture, a 3-faced deity whose power transcended the boundaries of any single tradition. Whether this was continuity or coincidence, we cannot say. But the people who worshipped the emerging god Shiva seem to have believed it was continuity. They seem to have sensed that they were inheriting something very old. The Yajurveda marks a turning point. In the Rigveda, Rudra is minor. 3 hymns, 39 verses, a god of the margins. But in the Yajurveda, and especially in the Shatarudriya, the 100 names of Rudra, something has shifted. The god is still terrifying, still the archer of disease and death, but he is also becoming something more. He is absorbing other beings, other concepts, other powers. He is dwelling in the mountains. He is lord of cattle and lord of the poor. He has 1,000 eyes and a blue throat. He is healer as well as harmer. He is, the texts begin to suggest, not merely one god among many, but something closer to a cosmic principle, a force that operates at every level of existence. This process of absorption and elevation would continue in the texts that followed. The Atharva Veda, the Upanishads, the great epics. By the time we reach the Mahabharata, composed between roughly 400 BCE and 400 CE, Rudra Shiva has become a fully developed figure of supreme power. The epic contains its own version of the Shatarudriya, extending and elaborating the 100 names. It tells stories of Shiva that would become canonical, his role in the cosmos, his relationships with other gods, his interventions in the affairs of humans and demons. And by the time the Puranas, the great compendia of myth and theology compiled in the 1st millennium CE, begin to take shape, the transformation is complete. The howling god of the storm, the marginal archer feared by the Vedic priests, has become Mahadeva, the great god. He has become Parameshwara, the supreme lord. He has become the centre of his own vast theological system, worshipped by millions, served by temples across the subcontinent, the subject of philosophies and practices that would endure for millennia. The synthesis that produced this Shiva was not a simple thing. It drew on Vedic sources, certainly, on Rudra's epithets, his associations, his terrible and beautiful nature. But it also drew on traditions that lay outside the Vedic world entirely. The Vratyas, wandering ascetics who lived on the margins of Vedic society, practicing austerities and possessing strange powers, contributed their lore of the renouncer, the yogi, the one who steps outside the social order to seek direct contact with the absolute. The indigenous peoples of the subcontinent, speakers of Dravidian languages, inhabitants of regions the Vedic culture had not originally penetrated, brought their own gods of the mountains and the forests, their own traditions of ecstatic worship and possession. And perhaps, if the Pashupati seal tells us anything, there was a thread running all the way back to the Indus Valley, a proto-Shiva who had never really disappeared but had only been waiting beneath the surface of things for his moment to emerge. The result was a god unlike any other in the Indian pantheon, a god who contained multitudes, a god who was simultaneously the terrifying destroyer and the gentle yogi, the cosmic dancer and the ash-smeared ascetic, the devoted husband and the wandering naked madman, a god who demanded everything, total devotion, total surrender, and who gave, in return, the promise of liberation from the wheel of birth and death itself. The great synthesis had begun. The Vedic Rudra had become something new, and the documentary that lies ahead, the myths of Sati and Parvati, the destruction of Daksha's sacrifice, the swallowing of the cosmic poison, the dance at the end and beginning of time, all of it flows from this moment of transformation. All of it is the story of Shiva, the god who howled before the world had a name and who will still be dancing when the world is ash. What the Vedic priests glimpsed at the edge of the firelight, what they addressed with fear and flattery, what they called by a hopeful name that meant auspicious in the desperate hope of turning its wrath aside. That God did not vanish as the centuries passed. He grew, he absorbed, he became the centre of everything he had once circled at the margins. And his story, which began with a howl in the dark, was only beginning, and now that story enters its first great cycle of fire and sorrow. To understand what happens next, we must meet a figure who embodies everything Shiva is not. His name is Daksha, and he is a son of Brahma himself, one of the Prajapatis, the progenitors, the lords of creation tasked with populating the cosmos and maintaining its order. Where Shiva dwells at the margins, Daksha commands the centre. Where Shiva wanders in ash and matted hair among the cremation grounds, Daksha presides over courts of ritual precision, over sacrifices performed with meticulous correctness, over a cosmic bureaucracy of dharma and propriety. He is civilization itself, codified and crowned. He is the father of daughters, many daughters, by some accounts 60, by others more, and through these daughters he has bound the cosmos together in a web of strategic marriages. The moon god Chandra married 27 of them. The great sages took others as wives. Through lineage and alliance, Daksha has woven himself into the fabric of divine society, and there is no ceremony of consequence, no great sacrifice, no gathering of gods at which he does not hold a place of honour. And among his daughters there is one called Sati. She's also known as Dakshayani, the daughter of Daksha, and her name means truth, or that which truly is, or simply being itself. She's not merely a princess of the Prajapatis, she is the first human embodiment of Adi Shakti, the primordial feminine energy from which all creation springs, the goddess herself, walking in mortal form, born into the household of the Lord of Propriety. And from the beginning she looked toward the mountains. The stories say that Sati recognized Shiva before she ever met him, that something in her knew what her father could never understand, that the ash-smeared ascetic, the dweller in cremation grounds, the god with serpents in his hair and poison in his throat was not the crude outcast her father believed him to be. He was the axis around which everything turned. He was consciousness itself. He was the still point at the centre of the cosmic dance. Sati saw past the matted locks and the smeared ash. She saw the yogi. She saw the Lord. She saw perhaps the one being in all the cosmos who was her equal and her completion. And so she undertook what the texts call tapas, austerities, disciplines, the systematic burning away of everything that is not essential. She fasted, she meditated, she sat motionless while seasons turned around her. She reduced herself to flame and will, and through that flame she called to him, and he heard, and he came down from the mountain, and he took her as his wife. This is not a small thing. The marriage of Shiva and Sati is the marriage of the wild and the orderly, the marginal and the central, the destroyer and the daughter of creation's Lord. It is a cosmic event. It should have healed something, bridged some gap in the structure of reality itself. But Daksha saw none of this. Daksha saw only that his daughter, the jewel of his household, had given herself to a creature he considered beneath contempt. The texts are explicit about Daksha's reasons. To him, Shiva was everything wrong with the cosmos, a consumer of intoxicants, a haunter of burning grounds where the dead are reduced to ash, a being who kept company with ghosts and goblins, with the Bhutaganas, the wild hosts of spirits that followed him like an army of the damned. Shiva wore animal skins. Shiva smeared himself with the ashes of cremation fires. Shiva had no lineage that Daksha could trace, no family seat, no position in the ordered hierarchy of heaven. He was chaos in divine form, and Daksha's daughter had married him, and this Daksha could not forgive. And so, when Daksha determined to perform the greatest sacrifice of his career, a yajna of such magnificence that all the gods and sages and kings of the cosmos would attend, he made a deliberate choice. He would not invite Shiva. He would not invite Sati. The Lord of the Margins would be reminded of exactly where he belonged, outside. The sacrifice was called the Brihaspatistava Yajna, and it was to be presided over by the sage Brigu, whose own relationship with Shiva was strained at best. The invitations went out across the three worlds. The Devas came, radiant in their celestial finery. The Prajapatis came, the other lords of creation, taking their places of honour near the great sacrificial fire. Kings and sages and celestial musicians, apsaras and gandharvas, all the luminaries of the ordered cosmos gathered at Daksha's command. The priests prepared the sacred fires, the offerings were arranged. The hymns rose toward heaven, addressed to the 12 Adityas, the solar deities, the lords of light and order. Everything was correct. Everything was precise. Everything was as it should be, according to Daksha's understanding of how the cosmos was meant to work. Everything except the empty space where Shiva should have stood. Word of the great sacrifice reached the mountain where Shiva and Sati dwelt. The accounts vary on how Sati learned of it, perhaps through divine perception, perhaps through travellers, perhaps simply through the great psychic reverberation that such a ceremony would send through the fabric of reality itself. But she learned, and she went to her husband and she asked to attend. Shiva's response tells us something essential about his character, something that would echo through all the myths to come. He did not rage. He did not demand his rights or protest the insult. He simply told her the truth. They had not been invited. To go to a sacrifice uninvited was a breach of dharma, a violation of cosmic etiquette. More than that, he knew what awaited her there. He knew her father's heart. He counselled her not to go. But Sati was the daughter of Daksha in more ways than one. She had her own will, her own sense of what was right, her own relationship with her father that preceded her marriage. The texts say she argued that a daughter need not wait for an invitation to visit her father's house. She insisted, and Shiva, who could unmake the cosmos with a thought, who held destruction itself in his hands, did not command her to stay. He let her go. This is the tragedy that Greek dramatists would have recognized. The free choice that leads to catastrophe, the door opened that can never be closed again. Sati, the goddess incarnate, the embodiment of primordial energy, walked alone into her father's house. She arrived at the yajna at its height. The fires blazed. The smoke of offerings rose in fragrant columns toward the sky. The gathered gods and sages turned to see the uninvited daughter enter, and a silence must have spread through the assembly, the kind of silence that precedes disaster. Daksha stood at the centre of his triumph, surrounded by everything he had built, everything he controlled, and his daughter walked toward him across the sacred ground. What followed was not a private conversation between father and daughter. It was a public humiliation designed to destroy. Daksha's contempt poured out in front of the assembled cosmos. Every grievance, every resentment, every judgment he had harboured against Shiva erupted now into denunciation. Her husband was a madman who wandered naked among corpses. Her husband kept company with demons and ghouls. Her husband consumed intoxicants that no respectable deity would touch. Her husband had no place in the ordered cosmos, no seat among the gods, no portion of the offerings, and by extension, neither did she. The sage Dadichi, who was present at the ceremony, noticed what Daksha's words confirmed. There was no sacrificial portion allotted to Shiva, no havis, no share of the offerings. More than that, no Vedic hymns addressed to him had been recited in the entire ritual. Shiva had been not merely excluded but erased, as if he did not exist, as if he were not a god at all but some shameful secret the cosmos had collectively agreed to forget. And Sati stood there and heard it all. The daughter of creation's lord heard her husband called unworthy. She heard him mocked before the entire assembly of heaven. She heard her father, the Prajapati, the embodiment of cosmic order, pour his contempt upon the god she loved, the god she had won through years of austerity, the god she had chosen over all the ordered propriety her father represented. What rose in her was not merely anger. It was something older and more terrible. She was, remember, the first embodiment of Adi Shakti, the primordial feminine power, the energy that underlies all creation. When that power turns toward destruction, the cosmos itself trembles. And in that moment, standing in the midst of her father's perfect sacrifice, Sati made a choice that would reshape geography itself. She could not bear the insult. She would not return to Shiva diminished by her father's contempt. She could not remain in a body born of a man who held her husband in such hatred. And so, in front of the assembled gods and sages and kings, in front of the blazing sacrificial fires that were meant to order the cosmos and propitiate the powers of light, Sati turned toward those fires and walked into them. She immolated herself on her father's altar. The texts describe it with the stark simplicity that marks the most sacred moments. She ran into the sacrificial fire. The goddess became the offering. The embodiment of Shakti, of primal creative energy, gave that energy back to the flames rather than continue to exist in a cosmos where her husband was dishonoured. And with that act, everything changed. The news reached Shiva on the mountain. How it reached him, whether through divine perception, through the sudden rupture in the fabric of reality that the death of the goddess must have caused, through some messenger who dared to bring such tidings. The texts do not always say. What they describe is what came after. Shiva's grief was not human grief. When a mortal loses a beloved, the world continues turning, indifferent to private sorrow. But Shiva is not mortal. Shiva is the principle of destruction itself, the power that will one day unmake the cosmos and return it to primordial chaos. When that power turns toward rage, the universe does not merely witness, it participates. In his wrath, Shiva reached up and tore a lock of hair from his own head. He was the god of matted locks, of hair that held the sacred Ganga, of ascetic discipline accumulated over eons. And he took that hair, that concentrated essence of his own power, and he hurled it against the ground. From that impact, two beings arose. The first was Virabhadra, the auspicious hero, though there was nothing auspicious about his purpose. He emerged fully formed and terrible, a warrior of absolute destruction, armed and armoured and burning with his creator's rage. He was Shiva's anger given independent form, Shiva's vengeance walking on two legs. The second was Bhadrakali, the fierce feminine, the dark goddess, Kali in one of her most terrible aspects. She arose alongside Virabhadra, his equal in fury, his partner in the devastation to come, and behind them came the Putaganas, the ghost armies, the spirit hosts, all the wild beings who had followed Shiva at the margins of the cosmos. They poured forth like a tide of chaos, and they marched south toward Daksha's sacrifice. What happened next was not a battle, it was an annihilation. Virabhadra and Bhadrakali and the host of spirits descended upon the yajna like a storm descends upon a village. The sacred fires were scattered, the offerings were overturned, the carefully maintained ritual order, the precise arrangements that Daksha had assembled to demonstrate his control over cosmic propriety, collapsed into carnage. Gods fled. Sages ran. The carefully invited guests of the Lord of Creation discovered that there are powers in the cosmos that do not respect invitations. Daksha himself could not escape. Virabhadra found him at the centre of his ruined sacrifice, the Lord of Propriety surrounded by the wreckage of everything he had built. And Virabhadra, with a single stroke, struck off Daksha's head. The Prajapati, son of Brahma, Lord of Creation, father of the goddess, headless on the ground of his own yajna. The devastation was complete. The site of the ritual, which had been assembled with such care to demonstrate the proper ordering of the cosmos, was a ruin. The message was unmistakable. There are margins that cannot be safely ignored, wildness that cannot be excluded from the order of things, powers that exist precisely because civilization fears them. Daksha had tried to build a cosmos without Shiva. The cosmos refused, but destruction, in the mythology of Shiva, is never the final word. What came next speaks to the paradox at the heart of this god. Shiva himself arrived at the ruined sacrifice, not Virabhadra, not the emanation of wrath, but the god himself. And when he saw what his rage had wrought, when he looked upon the headless body of his father-in-law, something shifted in him. He forgave Daksha, not because the insult had been any less grievous, not because Sati's death had been any less devastating, but because Shiva is the god who contains all opposites, who destroys and renews, who rages and relents, the same power that unmade Daksha's sacrifice could restore what it had broken. Shiva resurrected Daksha from death, but because the lord of propriety's own head had been lost in the chaos, Shiva replaced it with the head of a goat, a sacrificial animal, a creature of the very rituals Daksha had devoted his existence to performing. The irony was precise and deliberate. Daksha would live, but he would wear the mark of his humiliation for all eternity. The Lord of Cosmic Order had been reordered himself. The cycle could have ended there, with Shiva's rage, Shiva's forgiveness, Shiva's return to the mountain. But Sati was still dead. The goddess was still ash, and Shiva was still a god whose capacity for destruction was exceeded only by his capacity for loss. He retrieved her body from the flames. What followed was not a funeral. It was not a proper cremation, not a release of the spirit to its next incarnation. Shiva lifted the body of his beloved from the pyre, placed it upon his shoulder, and began to walk. He walked across the three worlds. He walked as a god in mourning, carrying the corpse of everything he had loved. The cosmos watched and could not look away. Here was the destroyer himself, reduced to wandering grief, unable to release what he had lost, unable to move forward, unable to do anything except carry the weight of his sorrow from one end of existence to the other. This was a crisis the universe had no framework to survive. Shiva's grief was not merely emotional, it was cosmic. The power of destruction, when turned inward, when locked in a loop of endless mourning, threatened the stability of everything that existed. A god who cannot act is as dangerous as a god who acts too much. Shiva's wandering paralyzed the cosmic order as surely as his rage had shattered Daksha's sacrifice. The other gods looked on in growing alarm. Brahma the creator and Vishnu the preserver saw what was happening and understood that something had to be done. But what? They could not simply take the body from Shiva. He was Shiva. They could not command him to release his grief. He was beyond command, beyond reason, lost in a sorrow that had become its own universe. It was Vishnu who found the answer, and the answer was as terrible as it was necessary. Vishnu possessed a weapon called the Sudarshana Chakra, a spinning disc of divine fire that could cut through anything in creation. It was his supreme cosmic weapon, the implement of ultimate severance. And as Shiva wandered, lost in grief, Vishnu began to use it. He did not strike Shiva, he struck Sati. With each revolution of the Sudarshana Chakra, another piece of the goddess's body was severed and fell away. Shiva did not notice at first, perhaps, or perhaps he could not stop walking, or perhaps some part of him understood what was happening and accepted it as the only possible resolution. The wheel cut and cut again, and the body of the goddess was divided, and the pieces fell to earth. According to the Pithanirnaya Tantra, the body was divided into 51 pieces. The Mahabhagavata Purana confirms this number, while the Devi Bhagavata Purana speaks of 108 sacred sites. The number varies, but the meaning does not. The goddess was scattered across the entire subcontinent and beyond, and where each piece fell, the very earth was transformed. Her yoni fell at Kamakhya in Kamarupa, in what is now Assam, and that site became the most powerful of all the goddess shrines, a place where the creative power of the feminine is worshipped in its most primal form. Elsewhere her eyes fell, her feet, her tongue, her breasts, fragments of the divine body distributing the goddess's power across geography itself. Most of these sites arose in India, but not all. 7 Shakti Pithas emerged in what is now Bangladesh. 3 appeared in Pakistan, 3 in Nepal, 1 each in Tibet, Sri Lanka and Bhutan. The goddess, in death, became a map. Her body became the sacred geography of an entire civilization. and at each site where a piece of the goddess fell, Shiva himself manifested in a particular form. He appeared as Bhairava, the fierce one, the terrifying one, the guardian aspect of the great god. At each Shaktipitha, a Bhairava temple stands guard, Shiva in his most protective mode watching over the fragment of his beloved that rests there. He had been unable to protect her in life. He would protect her forever in death. This is what Vishnu accomplished with the Sudarshana chakra. By dismembering the goddess, he did not destroy her, he distributed her. The concentrated energy of Mahashakti, which had been locked in Shiva's wandering grief, was released across the earth. Instead of one impossible burden that paralysed the destroyer, there were now dozens of accessible shrines where devotees could connect with the goddess's power. Vishnu had transformed tragedy into infrastructure. He had made grief into geography. And Shiva, as the last piece fell away, as the weight on his shoulder finally lifted, was released from his paralysis. The wandering stopped. The cosmic crisis resolved. The destroyer was free to return to his mountain, to his meditation, to the long stillness that would precede the next great cycle of myth. But nothing was the same. Sati was gone, scattered across the earth, present everywhere and nowhere, transformed from a single goddess into a network of sacred sites. The 51 or 108 Shaktipithas remain today, still worshipped, still visited by millions of pilgrims who understand that they are walking on ground sanctified by divine tragedy. When you stand at Kamakhya, you are standing where the goddess fell. When you visit any of these sites, you are entering a space created by Shiva's grief and Vishnu's intervention and the sacrifice of a woman who chose fire over dishonour. The mythology understands something profound here. Grief, when it is divine grief, when it is the sorrow of cosmic principles, does not merely pass, it transforms, it leaves marks on the world that endure for millennia. The Shaktipithas are those marks. They are the scars that Shiva's mourning left on the body of the earth itself. And yet the story was not over. Sati had immolated herself, but Sati was also the goddess. The goddess does not end. She merely withdraws, gathers herself, and returns in a new form. Already, as Shiva retreated to his mountain, as the world settled into its new configuration of sacred sites and Bhairava guardians, the next incarnation was preparing herself. Her name would be Parvati, daughter of the mountain, child of Himavat himself. She would be born in the very peaks where Shiva had chosen to dwell, in the shadow of the god who had become a permanent ascetic, withdrawn from the world, lost in meditation that would last for ages. She would not be Sati. She would have no memory of that former life, no consciousness of having been the goddess before, but she would be drawn to the same god, moved by the same cosmic love, destined to spend years in austerity of her own, earning the right to wake the god of destruction from his eternal stillness. That story awaited. But for now, Shiva sat alone on Kailash, the ashes of sacrifice and the memory of fire and the 51 wounds in the earth where his beloved had fallen. The first great cycle had completed itself. The god at the margins had been excluded. The cosmos had paid for that exclusion, and the very ground beneath the feet of worshippers had been marked forever by what followed. The wild cannot be left outside the fire's edge. The destroyer cannot be denied his portion. This is what Daksha learned too late, with a goat's head replacing his own. This is what Sati knew when she chose the flames. This is what the Shaktipithas still whisper to anyone who stands within their precincts. The gods are not abstractions. Their loves and rages reshape the world we walk through. And on the mountain, waiting, the god who howled before time began sat in the stillness that precedes another beginning. And on that mountain, in that stillness, Shiva remained, not for days, not for years. For ages beyond counting, the destroyer sat motionless on Kailash, his body gradually becoming indistinguishable from the stone itself, snow settling on his matted hair, ice forming in the crevices of his stillness. His eyes were closed. His breath had slowed to something that barely stirred the frozen air. The third eye on his forehead, that terrible aperture of destruction, remained shut, dormant, a weapon sheathed in the flesh of a god who had turned entirely inward. This was not sleep. This was not rest. This was samadhi so profound that it bordered on absence. The consciousness of the destroyer withdrawn so far from the manifest world that he had become, in a sense, a vacancy at the heart of existence. The god who had howled into being before the first fire, the god whose presence had terrified even the other deities of the Vedic pantheon, had vacated his post. He was there and not there, present in form, absent in function, and the cosmos began to feel his absence. Not immediately, not catastrophically, but slowly, like a garden that receives no rain, like a fire that receives no fuel, the universe began to show the strain. The principle that Shiva embodied, destruction, yes, but also the destruction that makes renewal possible, the ending that creates space for beginning, had gone dormant. Without his engagement, the cosmic cycles began to stutter. Old things that should have ended lingered past their time. New things that should have emerged remained trapped in potential, unable to break through into manifestation. The theology here is precise, and the mythology understands it even if it does not articulate it in philosophical terms. Shiva is not merely one god among many. He is one of the three fundamental operations of existence itself: creation, preservation, destruction. And when he withdraws, the machinery of reality loses a crucial gear. Brahma continues to create, Vishnu continues to preserve, but without Shiva's destruction to clear the way, creation becomes cluttered, preservation becomes stagnation. The Devas noticed. Of course they noticed. These were the shining gods of heaven, the inheritors of the Vedic pantheon, the beings who depended on the orderly function of the cosmos for their very existence. When the rhythm of reality began to falter, when the great cycles began to slow, they felt it in their very substance. Indra in his heaven, Agni in his fires, Vayu in his winds, all of them sensed that something fundamental had shifted. The destroyer had retreated, and his retreat was becoming a problem, but they did not know yet how terrible that problem would become. In another realm, in another time, a demon was preparing to take advantage of the cosmic vacancy that Shiva had left behind. His name was Tarakasura, Taraka the star demon, a being of immense power and cunning ambition. He understood something that the Devas had not yet grasped, that the withdrawal of Shiva represented not merely a theological inconvenience, but a strategic opportunity. Taraka was clever, he was patient, and he knew the rules of the cosmic game better than almost anyone who played it. He went to perform tapas of his own. This is one of the great equalizers of Hindu mythology, the principle that austerity grants power, that the willing destruction of comfort accumulates spiritual capital that even the gods must honor. A demon, through sufficient penance, can earn boons that bind the divine. The cosmos has rules that even Brahma cannot break, and one of those rules is that tapas must be rewarded. Taraka's austerities were severe. He stood on one foot for centuries. He reduced his food to nothing, his breath to almost nothing, his very existence to a single point of concentrated will. He burned in his own discipline until the heat of his penance began to disturb the very fabric of reality, until Brahma himself, the creator, the granter of boons, had no choice but to appear before him. And here is where Taraka's cleverness showed itself. He did not ask for immortality. He knew that absolute immortality was the one boon that could not be granted, that death must come to all beings eventually, that even Brahma could not undo this fundamental law. So he asked for something almost as good. He asked for the one loophole that he believed could never be closed. "Grant me this," Taraka said to Brahma, "that I can only be killed by a son of Shiva." Think about the genius of this request. Think about what Taraka knew and what he was exploiting. Shiva's wife Sati had just died. Not just died, but immolated herself, destroyed herself utterly in the flames of her own outrage. Shiva was deep in meditation, withdrawn from the world, showing no interest whatsoever in marriage or companionship or anything that might lead to the production of a son. The god of destruction had renounced the very possibility of progeny. A son of Shiva, at that moment in cosmic history, was the most impossible thing in the universe. Brahma granted the boon. He had no choice. Taraka's tapas had earned the reward, and the request did not violate the fundamental rules. It was not absolute immortality. It was merely conditional invulnerability. And if the condition happened to be practically impossible, well, that was Taraka's cleverness, not Brahma's responsibility. Armed with this boon, Taraka began his conquest. He moved first against the lesser realms, testing his new invulnerability, watching his enemies' weapons shatter uselessly against his skin. When he was certain that the boon held, that he truly could not be killed by anyone except the non-existent son of a celibate god, he turned his attention upward. He turned his attention to Svarga itself, to heaven, to the realm of the Devas, to the very throne of Indra. The war that followed was not a war. It was a rout. It was a systematic dismantling of celestial power by a being who knew that nothing in heaven could harm him. Indra's thunderbolt, the Vajra, the weapon that had slain demon after demon, the symbol of divine sovereignty, struck Taraka and did nothing. Agni's flames washed over him and left him laughing. Vayu's storms, Varuna's waters, the combined might of all the shining gods of the Vedic heaven. None of it mattered. None of it could matter. Taraka drove the gods from their own realm. He took Svarga for himself, sat on Indra's throne, declared himself lord of the three worlds, heaven, earth, and the realms below. The cosmic order that the Devas had maintained since the beginning of the current age was shattered, replaced by the tyranny of a demon who could not be stopped, and on his mountain Shiva meditated, unaware or unconcerned, lost in depths of contemplation that had nothing to do with the suffering of gods or the conquest of demons. The one being who might have fathered the weapon that could end Taraka's reign sat in perfect stillness, grieving a wife who had been dead for ages, refusing to engage with a world that so desperately needed him. This is the paradox that the mythology forces us to confront. Shiva's withdrawal is not mere selfishness. It is the authentic expression of his nature as the ascetic god, the renouncer, the one who has seen through the illusions of the manifest world. His meditation is holy, his grief is divine, his refusal to engage with worldly concerns is exactly what makes him Shiva rather than some lesser deity caught up in the drama of existence. And yet that same withdrawal, that same holiness, that same divine grief was allowing Taraka to enslave the cosmos. The Devas gathered in exile somewhere beyond the reach of Taraka's power, and they deliberated. They knew about the boon. They understood its terms. Only a son of Shiva could kill Taraka, and Shiva had no intention of producing a son. The equation seemed impossible. The trap that Taraka had constructed seemed inescapable. But the gods had one advantage that Taraka had not fully calculated. They knew that Sati was not merely dead. They knew that Sati was the goddess herself, that Adishakti had incarnated once and would incarnate again, that the cosmic feminine principle does not remain dormant forever. Somewhere, they believed, the goddess was preparing to return. Somewhere, in some form, Shakti was gathering herself for another entry into the manifest world. And if Shakti returned, if she could somehow win the attention of the god lost in his meditation, if she could wake Shiva from his ages-long withdrawal and draw him back into engagement with existence, then a son might be possible. Then the weapon that could destroy Taraka might be born. They learned, through ways that the mythology does not specify. Divine intuition, perhaps, or the knowledge that flows between cosmic principles, that the goddess had already incarnated. She had been born as Parvati, daughter of Himavat, the king of the mountains, and Meena, his queen. She had been born in the very shadow of Kailash, in the peaks where Shiva sat in his eternal meditation, as if the universe itself were engineering the circumstances of its own rescue. Parvati. The name means she of the mountains, and it was perfect for her origin and her destiny. She had been born of stone and snow and altitude, born in the thin air where ordinary beings cannot breathe, born with the Himalayas as her inheritance and Shiva as her neighbour. But she did not know at first who she was. She did not know that she was the goddess returned, that she had been Sati in a previous life, that her soul carried the memory of loving the destroyer even if her conscious mind did not. She grew up as a princess of the mountain kingdom, beautiful and bright, devoted to the gods in the simple way that mortals are devoted, not knowing that she was one of them, that she had been one of them, that she would be one of them again. What she knew, what she felt from her earliest awareness was the pull, the attraction, the sense that somewhere in the heights above her father's kingdom, someone waited who was meant for her. She would look up at the snow-covered peaks where Shiva was said to meditate, and she would feel something stir in her that she could not name. Love, perhaps. Recognition, perhaps. Or perhaps just the cosmic destiny that was written into her very incarnation, making itself known. She began to visit the mountain, to bring flowers and offerings to the place where the god sat motionless, to tend to his space, to worship him, to wait nearby in hopes that he might open his eyes, might notice her, might acknowledge her existence. She was a princess performing the devotions of a servant, a goddess in disguise serving the god who did not know she had returned to him. Shiva did not respond. His eyes remained closed. His meditation did not waver. For all the attention he paid to the beautiful young woman who came day after day with flowers and prayers, she might as well have been a cloud passing over the sun. He was beyond noticing. He was beyond caring. The world of forms and desires and relationships had ceased to have any meaning for him. The Devas grew desperate. Time was passing, and Taraka's tyranny was only growing more entrenched. They needed Shiva to wake, to see Parvati, to desire her, to marry her, to produce the son who could save them all. But how do you wake a god who has chosen not to be awakened? How do you kindle desire in a being who has transcended desire altogether? They decided to send Kamadeva, Kama, the god of love, the lord of desire, the beautiful archer whose flower arrows can ignite passion in any heart. If anyone could break through Shiva's meditation, could pierce the armor of his renunciation, could force him to feel again, surely it was Kama. Surely those legendary arrows, which had never failed, which had kindled love in gods and mortals and demons alike, could accomplish what patience and proximity had not. Kama accepted the mission, though he knew its dangers. He was the god of desire, yes, but he was not naive. He understood that he was being sent to disturb the most dangerous being in the cosmos, to interfere with meditation that had lasted for ages, to force feeling upon a god who had deliberately annihilated his capacity to feel. This was not like shooting arrows at some lovesick mortal or some reluctant deity. This was an assault on the destroyer himself. But the fate of the cosmos hung in the balance, and Kama was brave. He came to Kailash with his bow of sugarcane and his arrows tipped with flowers. His wife Rati, goddess of passion, accompanied him, perhaps sensing that she might need to witness what was about to happen, perhaps hoping to lend her own power to his. Spring itself came with them, the season of love, the time when desire moves most freely through the world, turning the frozen slopes momentarily verdant, filling the mountain air with warmth and fragrance and possibility. Parvati was there, as she was always there, waiting near the god who would not notice her. Kama positioned himself where he could see both the meditating Shiva and the devoted Parvati. He drew his bow, he sighted along the flower arrow, he let fly. The arrow struck Shiva, and Shiva's eyes opened, not gently, not gradually. The three eyes of the destroyer snapped open like wounds suddenly inflicted on the surface of reality, and in the instant of their opening Shiva knew everything. He knew that he had been disturbed. He knew that desire had been artificially injected into his consciousness. He knew that somewhere nearby, the god of love was standing with an empty bow, having just committed the most dangerous act of disruption in cosmic history. The third eye, that terrible eye in the center of Shiva's forehead, the eye that had remained dormant through all the ages of his meditation, blazed open. Fire poured from it. Not metaphorical fire, not spiritual fire. Actual flames, concentrated destruction, the wrath of the god who had been pulled from his depths by an arrow he had not asked for. The fire found Kama. The fire consumed Kama. In an instant, the god of love was ash on the wind, his sugarcane bow a wisp of smoke, his flower arrows scattered petals burning to nothing, his beautiful form reduced to the ultimate destruction. Annihilation by the eye of Shiva. Rati screamed. The Devas, watching from afar, despaired. They had sent Kama to wake Shiva, and Shiva had destroyed him without a moment's hesitation, without a flicker of regret. The plan had failed. Worse than failed, it had cost them one of their own, had eliminated the god of love from the cosmos, had proven that Shiva's meditation was not merely deep but violently defended. Parvati, standing nearby, watched all of this unfold. She saw the god she loved open his eyes for the first time in ages. She saw the fire pour forth. She saw Kama burn to nothing for the crime of trying to make Shiva look at her. And she understood, in that moment, what would be required. Kama's arrows had failed. External force had failed. The god of love himself, with all his power, had been unable to penetrate the fortress of Shiva's renunciation for more than an instant before being destroyed. If Parvati wanted Shiva, and she did want him, with a wanting that went deeper than this single lifetime, that reached back to her existence as Sati and forward to her destiny as Shakti, she would need to find another way. She would need to become something that Shiva could not ignore. Not through beauty, not through the artificial manipulation of desire, but through the one quality that Shiva respected above all others, the one path that could reach him in his withdrawal, the one currency that had value in the economy of divine attention: tapas, austerity, the systematic destruction of comfort, the annihilation of the small self, the burning away of everything that was not absolute devotion. This was the language that Shiva spoke. This was the practice that defined his existence. If Parvati could match him, if she could prove that her desire was not mere attraction but cosmic necessity, then perhaps he might look at her with different eyes. She did not hesitate. She did not go home to her father's palace to consider the matter. She did not weep over Kama's ashes or despair at the difficulty of what lay ahead. She had seen what she needed to see: the opening of Shiva's eyes, the power that dwelt behind them, the utter futility of trying to win him through ordinary means. And she understood her path. She began her tapas. Parvati stripped away her princess's garments and donned the rough cloth of an ascetic. She abandoned the comforts of her father's kingdom and took up residence in the wilderness, in the mountains, in the very peaks where Shiva sat in his meditation. She would be near him, always near him, but she would no longer come as a devotee bringing offerings. She would come as an equal, a fellow renouncer, a being who had chosen the same path of radical self-denial that he walked. Her austerities were severe. She fasted until her body began to consume itself. She stood on one leg for years at a time. She sat in the midst of fires in summer, letting the flames lick at her skin, proving that she could endure what would destroy any ordinary being. She submerged herself in freezing water in winter, letting the cold invade her bones, demonstrating that physical comfort had no hold on her. The texts tell us that she gave up food entirely, not merely reduced her intake, not merely simplified her diet, but ceased to eat altogether. First, she abandoned cooked food, then raw food. Then she stopped eating even the leaves that grew around her. The most minimal sustenance that an ascetic might take. And it was for this that she earned the name Apana, she who takes no leaf. Her mother Meena, watching her daughter waste away in the mountains, cried out, "Uma!" Oh, don't. And this too became an epithet, Uma, that would follow the goddess through all her subsequent mythology. But Parvati would not be dissuaded. Her mother's tears, her father's protests, the warnings of the sages who observed her austerities with a mixture of admiration and terror, none of it could move her from her purpose. She had set out to match Shiva in renunciation, to prove that her devotion was not inferior to his withdrawal, to demonstrate that love could be as fierce and as consuming as meditation. And she succeeded. Oh, how she succeeded. Her tapas grew so powerful that the heat of her austerity began to affect the very structure of the cosmos. The heavens shook, the earth trembled. The fundamental forces that held reality together felt the pressure of a goddess burning herself away in pursuit of a god who would not look at her. The Devas, who had hoped that Parvati might win Shiva through gentler means, watched with a mixture of awe and alarm. This was not what they had planned. They had wanted a courtship, a seduction, a gradual warming of Shiva's frozen heart. Instead, they were witnessing a collision of absolutes, two beings, each capable of annihilating themselves through the intensity of their practice, grinding against each other like tectonic plates. Shiva, for his part, could not remain unaware. The trembling of the cosmos reached even the depths of his meditation. The heat of Parvati's tapas, burning somewhere in the mountains near him, began to register on his consciousness like the warmth of a fire felt through closed eyes. He did not open those eyes, not yet, but he began to be aware that something extraordinary was happening in his vicinity. He sent tests. He disguised himself as a wandering Brahmin and visited Parvati in her austerity, questioning her purpose, challenging her devotion, mocking the god she claimed to love. He described Shiva in the worst possible terms: a beggar, a madman, a haunter of cremation grounds, a being covered in ash and surrounded by ghosts, utterly unsuitable for a princess of the mountains. Surely, the Brahmin suggested, she could do better. Surely her beauty and her lineage entitled her to a more appropriate husband. Parvati did not waver. She defended Shiva to the Brahmin with a passion that proved her devotion was not superficial. that she truly understood who and what Shiva was, that she loved him, not despite his terrifying aspects, but because of them. She saw through the surfaces to the essence beneath. She recognized the consciousness behind the ashes, the cosmic principle behind the beggar's disguise, and she passed the test. When Shiva finally revealed himself, when he dropped the Brahmin's form and showed her his true nature, majestic and terrible, and exactly what she had spent years of austerity trying to reach, he spoke words that changed everything. "Because of your tapas," he told her, "I shall be your servant from this moment on." Think about the weight of this declaration. The God who had withdrawn from the world, who had rejected all engagement, who had burned Kama to ash for trying to force him to feel, this God was now declaring himself the servant of the woman whose only weapon had been her willingness to destroy herself in pursuit of him. Parvati had not conquered Shiva through beauty, or through the manipulation of desire. She had won him through the one thing he respected, the capacity to annihilate the self. She had matched him. She had equalled his renunciation, and in that equality she had proven herself worthy of union with the destroyer. Shiva agreed to marry her. The wedding of Shiva and Parvati is one of the great set pieces of Hindu mythology, a spectacle that brings together the terrifying and the beautiful, the cosmic and the comic, the sublime and the absurd. It is the moment when the god of the margins finally enters into proper relation with the social order, when the wild ascetic agrees to become a husband, when the principle of destruction yokes itself to the principle of creative energy. But it was also a wedding unlike any other. When the groom's party came to claim the bride, they came from Kailash, from the mountain of ghosts and ashes, from the realm where Shiva had spent ages in meditation, surrounded by beings that no civilized gathering would welcome. The procession that wound down from the heights was not a display of divine majesty in any conventional sense. It was a parade of everything that proper society fears and excludes. Shiva came with matted hair that had not been combed in ages, dreadlocks piled on his head like coiled serpents. He came covered in ash, the ash of cremation grounds, the ash of burned bodies, the ash that marked him as the god who haunts the places where life ends. He wore the fresh skin of an elephant, still dripping with blood, wrapped around him like a royal robe. His body was smeared with the remnants of his meditation, with the accumulated marks of his withdrawal from everything clean and orderly and socially acceptable. And his entourage was worse. Ghosts accompanied him, pretas, the hungry spirits of the unquiet dead. Goblins and demons walked in his train, beings of distorted form and terrible aspect. Ash-smeared yogis and wild-eyed ascetics made up his wedding party, men who had themselves renounced the social order and adopted Shiva's way of life. Strange sounds filled the air, languages no one could understand, cries and howls and chants in tongues that predated human speech. This was the groom coming to claim a princess of the mountains. Parvati's mother Meena took one look at this procession and fainted. Her daughter was going to marry that. Her beautiful Parvati, princess of the Himalayas, was going to be given in marriage to a blood-soaked beggar surrounded by ghosts. The horror was too much for a mother's heart to bear. Even Himavat, the mountain king, protested. He had agreed to the marriage. How could he refuse when the gods themselves had indicated that this union was necessary? But he had not expected this. He had not anticipated that the groom would arrive looking like something from the worst nightmares of civilized society. His anger rose. His objections multiplied. For a moment it seemed as though the wedding might fail at the last possible stage, derailed not by divine obstruction but by a father-in-law's completely understandable reluctance. It was Narada who intervened. Narada, the wandering sage with his single-stringed instrument, his ekatara, the divine troublemaker and messenger who moved between all the worlds carrying news and stirring events into motion. Narada stepped forward and spoke in Shiva's defense, and his words cut through the surface appearances to the essence beneath. He has no father, Narada said of Shiva. He has no mother. His basis is sound, reverberation. This was theology as intervention. Narada was reminding the assembled company that they were not looking at an ordinary groom. They were looking at the primordial principle of destruction itself, the cosmic vibration that precedes and underlies all manifestation, the God who had no origin because he was origin. The ash and blood and ghosts were not defects. They were expressions of his nature. The terror that surrounded him was not a failure of civilization. It was a reminder that existence itself rests on foundations that lie beyond all civilized categories. But Parvati, ever practical, ever willing to meet her husband in the middle ground between his wildness and her family's conventions, asked for a compromise. She asked Shiva to take on a more pleasant form, just for the wedding, just for her mother's sake. She did not demand that he change his nature. She had spent years in tapas proving that she loved him as he truly was, but she requested a temporary accommodation, a gesture of graciousness toward the human sensibilities that could not easily absorb his cosmic terror. And Shiva, because he loved her, because she had earned his devotion through her own devotion, agreed. He put on a beautiful form. He transformed himself into something that Meena could look at without fainting, that Himavat could welcome without despair. He did not cease to be Shiva. The ash was still there, the power was still there, the fundamental nature remained unchanged. But he wrapped that nature in a more accessible appearance. The wedding proceeded. At Triyuginarayan in Uttarakhand, where the texts tell us a sacred fire burns even today, Shiva and Parvati were married according to proper Vedic rites. The fire witnessed their vows. The celestial sages chanted the appropriate mantras. The 7 steps, the Sat Viya, were taken around the flame. The god of destruction and the goddess of creative energy were bound together in a union that would reshape the very structure of Hindu theology. This was not a domestication of Shiva. Let no one imagine that the wild god of the margins was tamed by marriage, reduced to an ordinary husband, brought within the boundaries of conventional behavior. Shiva remained Shiva, the haunter of cremation grounds, the lord of ghosts, the ascetic whose meditation could shake the cosmos. But he was now Shiva in relation, Shiva in partnership, Shiva yoked to the creative principle that could channel his destructive power toward cosmic purpose. And this union, this yoking, this yoga in its most literal sense, became the theological engine of Tantra. For Tantra, the wedding of Shiva and Parvati is not merely a mythological event. It is a cosmic fact with ongoing implications. Shiva represents pure consciousness, awareness without object, perception without content, the witness that underlies all experience but is itself beyond experience. Parvati represents Shakti, energy, power, the dynamic force that makes anything happen, the creative principle that brings worlds into being. Neither is complete without the other. Consciousness without energy is inert, unchanging, sterile, a witness with nothing to witness. Energy without consciousness is chaos, blind force, power without directional meaning. But when they unite, when Shiva and Shakti come together in the cosmic marriage that the Triyuginarayan wedding represents, then creation becomes possible. Then the universe can arise and be sustained and transform. Then the dance of existence can proceed. The tantric texts would elaborate this theology for centuries. They would develop practices based on the union of masculine and feminine principles, techniques for raising the dormant Shakti energy that lies coiled at the base of the spine and bringing it to meet the Shiva consciousness that dwells at the crown of the head. They would see in the marriage of Shiva and Parvati a template for the spiritual journey itself, the reunion of what was never truly separate, the recognition that consciousness and energy are 2 aspects of a single reality. But all of that development lay in the future. For now, in the mythological present of the wedding at Triyuginarayan, what mattered was the simple fact. Shiva had been drawn back into engagement with the world. The god who had withdrawn after Sati's death, who had sat motionless on Kailash while Taraka conquered the 3 worlds, had been reached. He had been moved. He had been married. And marriage, in the divine economy, implied the possibility of offspring. The devas who watched the wedding from their exile knew what this meant. The impossible condition that Taraka had built into his boon, that only a son of Shiva could kill him, was no longer impossible. Shiva had a wife. Shiva might have a son. The weapon that could destroy the demon tyrant might, at last, be born. After the wedding, Shiva and Parvati departed together for Kailash. The mountain that had been the site of Shiva's solitary meditation would now be their shared home. The ashes and the ghosts and the wild beings that surrounded the destroyer would have to make room for the presence of the goddess, for the creative energy that had chosen to dwell with the principle of destruction. But how the son would be born, the son who would destroy Taraka, who would justify the Deva's desperate scheming, who would fulfill the purpose for which the cosmos had engineered Parvati's incarnation, that story remained to be told, and it would not be a simple story. It would not be a straightforward tale of divine conception and heroic birth. It would be as strange and as multifaceted as everything else in the mythology of Shiva, as marked by paradox and interruption, an unexpected transformation as the god himself. For now, Shiva and Parvati were together, the cosmic husband and the cosmic wife, consciousness and energy, the destroyer and the creatrix, two absolutes, yoked in marriage, dwelling together on the mountain where the world's myths gathered and prepared themselves for the next great telling. The tyranny of Taraka continued. The Devas remained in exile. The crisis that had brought about this marriage had not yet been resolved. But the conditions for resolution were now in place. The seed had been planted. The union that would produce the divine warrior was accomplished. Everything that followed, the birth of Kartikeya, the war against the demon host, the restoration of cosmic order, flowed from this moment, from the wedding of wildness and the mountain, from the joining of Shiva and Parvati in a marriage that would never be ordinary, never be conventional, never be anything less than the fundamental fact on which Hindu theology would build its most sophisticated structures. On Kailash, the god and goddess began their eternal conversation. The questions that Parvati would ask and the answers that Shiva would give would become the tantras themselves, the secret teachings, the transformative wisdom, the knowledge of how consciousness and energy interact to produce the universe, and how they can be reunited in the awareness of the seeker. But that teaching lay ahead. That elaboration awaited. For now, there was only the presence of the two together. The marriage accomplished, the withdrawal ended, the generative principle restored to its place in the cosmic machinery. Taraka's doom was sealed, though he did not yet know it. The boon that had seemed so clever, that had made his invulnerability depend on an impossible birth, had been outmaneuvered by the patient workings of cosmic necessity. Shiva had a wife, Shiva would have a son, and that son would be the weapon that ended Taraka's reign. The next great cycle of myth was preparing itself to unfold. But before that son could be born, before Kartikeya could ride forth against the demon armies, before the resolution of the Taraka crisis could unfold, another story intervened. A story older in some tellings, concurrent in others, woven through the tapestry of Puranic narrative like a dark thread that catches the light unexpectedly. A story that revealed something essential about Shiva's nature, something that the Vedic poets who first invoked Rudra might have recognized, though they could never have imagined its full elaboration. This was the story of the churning of the ocean, the Samudra Manthan, the great cosmic labour that brought forth treasures and terrors from the primordial deep. And at its centre, or rather, at the moment when its centre threatened to become an annihilating void, stood Shiva, alone, doing what no other being in the universe was willing to do. The ocean in question was not an ocean of water. The Bhagavata Purana and the Vishnu Purana speak of it as the Kshirasagara, the ocean of milk, the primordial sea from which all things could be extracted if only the right method were applied. And the method that the gods and demons agreed upon was churning, as one might churn butter from cream, as one might agitate the still surface of possibility until it yielded its hidden substances. The arrangement was this. Mount Mandara, one of the cosmic peaks that anchored the universe, would serve as the churning rod. The great serpent Vasuki, king of the Nagas, whose body stretched for lengths beyond mortal measurement, would be wrapped around the mountain as the churning rope. The Devas would pull from one end, the Asuras from the other, and together, in rare and temporary cooperation, they would rotate the mountain and agitate the ocean until it surrendered its treasures. Chief among these treasures, they hoped, was Amrita, the nectar of immortality. The Devas wanted it because they feared death, because they had been weakened by conflict with the demons, because their power had waned and they needed restoration. The Asuras wanted it for the same reasons, and because immortality would make their conquest of the three worlds permanent and unchallengeable. Both sides were willing to work together for the churning, each planning to seize the nectar for themselves when it finally emerged. What neither side fully understood was what else the ocean contained, what lay sleeping in those milky depths, waiting to be disturbed, what would emerge before any treasure could be claimed. The churning began. Mount Mandara rotated in the cosmic sea, Vasuki's coils tightening and loosening as the two teams pulled in alternation. The effort was immense. The mountain pressed down into the ocean floor. The serpent hissed and strained. The Devas and Asuras sweated and groaned with the labour. But gradually, impossibly, the ocean began to yield. Objects rose from the depths. Treasures that had been locked away since before the current age of the world. The divine cow Kamadhenu, who could grant any wish. the horse Ushchaishravas, white as moonlight, swift as thought, the elephant Airavata, who would become Indra's mount, the goddess Lakshmi herself, radiant with beauty and fortune, emerged from the churning sea and chose Vishnu as her eternal companion. Gem after gem, wonder after wonder, the ocean surrendered its hoarded wealth. But these treasures came later. First, before the wish-granting cow, before the divine horse, before the goddess of fortune, something else rose from the agitated depths, something that was not a treasure at all. The Halahala emerged. The texts describe it as poison, but the word is inadequate. This was not a liquid that might be contained in a vessel, not a substance that might be neutralized by some antidote. This was the most vicious and venomous poison of the universe, concentrated malevolence given physical form, entropy itself rendered tangible. It was perhaps all the potential destruction that had been suspended in the primordial ocean since the beginning of things, the shadow side of creation, the price that existence pays for coming into being, the darkness that must exist if there is to be light. And it did not merely emerge, it spread. Its fumes began to fill the space around the churning mountain, began to seep outward into the three worlds, began to poison the very air that gods and demons breathed. The effects were immediate and catastrophic. Both devas and asuras, despite their differences, despite their enmity, began to collapse. They could not breathe. Their lungs seized. Their bodies failed. The mighty gods who had fought cosmic wars, the powerful demons who had conquered heaven itself, all of them fell, choking, dying, helpless before this enemy that could not be fought with weapons or subdued with power. The churning stopped. The great project that was supposed to yield immortality was yielding only death. Mount Mandara hung suspended in the ocean, Vasuki's coils slack with exhaustion, and all around the cosmic labour site the forces of heaven and hell lay gasping, asphyxiating, perishing. What could be done? Neither side had anticipated this. Neither side had planned for a poison that could not be contained, a toxin that threatened to extinguish all life before any treasure could be claimed. The devas, through their fading consciousness, understood that they needed help. Help beyond their own depleted resources, help from a source that stood outside the immediate crisis. They ran to Brahma, the creator, the grandfather of gods and demons alike, the one whose knowledge encompassed the structure of the cosmos. Surely Brahma would know what to do. Surely the first of the Trimurti would have some solution, some technique, some power that could neutralize the spreading death. But Brahma's response offered no immediate solution. He told the Devas what they had perhaps already sensed but had been unwilling to admit. Only Shiva could help them. Only the destroyer, the dweller on Kailash, the one who existed at the boundary between being and non-being. Only he had any hope of containing what the ocean had released. The journey to Mount Kailash must have felt endless. The Devas and Asuras, united now in desperation, their rivalry temporarily suspended by mutual catastrophe, made their way to the sacred mountain where Shiva dwelt with his newlywed wife Parvati. Behind them, the Halahala continued its expansion. The worlds were dying. Time was running out. They found Shiva and they prayed. These were gods who rarely prayed to anyone, demons who acknowledged no power greater than their own ambitions, but now they prostrated themselves before the Lord of Destruction, begging for intervention, pleading for salvation. The pride of the Devas, the arrogance of the Asuras, all of it dissolved in the face of extinction. They asked Shiva to save them. They asked him to save everything, and Shiva agreed. Consider what this meant. Consider what Shiva was consenting to do. He was not being asked to fight an enemy, to lead an army, to exercise his destructive power against some demon that threatened cosmic order. He was being asked to absorb destruction itself, to take into his own body the poison that was killing everything else, to become the vessel for an annihilating force that no other being, god or demon, creator or preserver, could withstand. He was being asked, in essence, to be destroyed so that others might live. The destroyer, offered up to destruction. The god of death, facing his own potential death. The one whose cosmic function was to end things, choosing to end himself, or at least to risk ending himself, for the sake of those who could not survive without his sacrifice. This is the theological heart of the Halahala story. This is why the Puranas preserve it, why devotees remember it, why the episode became central to understanding who Shiva is. He could have refused. He could have retreated deeper into his mountain, let the poison do its work, allowed the churning project to fail, and the Devas and Asuras alike to perish. He had no obligation to save them. He had not participated in their scheme. He had not asked them to disturb the primordial ocean or to release forces they could not control. But he chose to help. He chose to absorb the halahala. He chose the path of sacrifice. Shiva took the poison into his hands. He raised it to his lips. He drank. The texts do not dwell on what this felt like, perhaps because no words could capture it. This was the concentrated malevolence of the universe, the distilled essence of everything that destroys, passing through the mouth and throat of the god. Even for Shiva, even for the one whose third eye could reduce worlds to ash, whose cosmic dance could unmake creation itself, this was something beyond ordinary experience. This was suffering taken on voluntarily, agony accepted freely, for the sake of others who could not endure what he was enduring. And then Parvati acted. The goddess saw her husband drinking the poison that was killing the universe. She saw the halahala entering his body, saw what it would do if it reached his stomach, if it spread through his divine form. She understood. Perhaps she was the only one who could understand that even Shiva might not survive if the poison completed its passage. So she gripped his throat with both hands. She held it closed. She would not let the poison descend. This image, the goddess clutching the god's neck, her hands a barrier between the halahala and his vital centers, contains multitudes of meaning. Parvati, the creative energy, containing and controlling the destructive force, the wife saving the husband who was saving the universe, Shakti and Shiva in intimate cooperation, her intervention making his sacrifice sustainable, her action transforming potential death into permanent transformation. The poison stayed in Shiva's throat. It could not ascend back out, and Parvati would not allow it to descend further. It was trapped there, suspended, neutralized but not eliminated, and the tissue of Shiva's throat, exposed to the halahala's concentrated malevolence, changed color. It turned blue. Forever after, Shiva would bear this mark. His throat, stained by the poison he had drunk to save the worlds, would remain the color of a bruise, the color of asphyxiation, the color of the sky at its darkest. He became Nilakantha, the blue-throated one, an epithet that appears in the earliest Vedic texts applied to Rudra centuries before the halahala story was composed, now given mythological explanation, now given narrative weight. The name that the Vedic priest had used without knowing its full meaning, Nilakantha, the one with the dark throat, was now understood as a mark of sacrifice, a scar of salvation, the visible sign of the moment when Shiva had drunk the poison of the universe and had been changed forever by the act. The cosmos was saved, the fumes dissipated, the Devas and Asuras recovered, the churning could resume, would eventually yield the Amrita and all the other treasures that the ocean contained. History would continue, the worlds would go on. But Shiva bore the price in his body. Every time devotees looked upon the blue-throated one, they were seeing the evidence of what he had done, what he had been willing to do. The god of destruction had become the vessel of destruction, had contained it within himself, had neutralized it through his own being, had transformed universal catastrophe into a discoloration of his own divine flesh. This is why the halahala story sits at the moral center of Shiva mythology, not because it shows his power, though it does, but because it shows his willingness, his consent, his choice to suffer for others, the destroyer who submits to destruction, the fearsome one who endures fear, the god at the edge of the world stepping forward when all the gods of light and order have failed, drinking the darkness so that there can still be light, the Rudra of the Rigveda, the howling one who brought fever and sudden death, the archer whose arrows could not be outrun. He was still present in Shiva, still part of his nature, still the aspect that made the gods plead with such urgent terror. But the halahala story revealed something else, revealed that the one who could destroy anything was also the one who would sacrifice everything, that the power to end was paired with the willingness to serve, that the darkness at the edge of the world was also somehow the light that saved the world from its own darkest production. Parvati's hands remained on his throat. In some tellings, they never left. She holds him still, eternally preventing the poison from completing its passage, eternally participating in his ongoing sacrifice. The goddess and god lock together in an embrace that is also an act of salvation, a posture of love that is also a posture of cosmic necessity. The blue-throated one returned to Kailash with his wife. The crisis was over. The churning would continue without him, the treasures would emerge, the Amrita would be fought over by gods and demons in the familiar patterns of celestial conflict. But Shiva's role was complete. He had done what only he could do. He had become Nilakantha, and this name, this epithet, this blue throat visible in every image and statue and painting of the destroyer, it would remind all who saw it of what had happened at the churning of the ocean, of the moment when everything might have ended, when the universe's own poison threatened to destroy the universe, when neither gods nor demons could save themselves, and of the one who stepped forward, the one who drank, the one who carries, still, the mark of his sacrifice in the changed colour of his throat. The Vedic poets who first called Rudra blue-throated could not have known this story. The name preceded the myth, the epithet preceded the explanation. But the story, when it came, fit the name perfectly, as if the Puranic storytellers were uncovering a truth that had always been present in the name, as if Nilakantha had always meant the one who will drink the poison, had always been waiting for its mythological context to be revealed. This is how Shiva's mythology works. Layers accumulating, names acquiring depth, epithets gaining stories, until the figure who emerges is not simply a character in a narrative but a repository of meanings, a nexus of symbols, a god who can absorb contradictions because his nature is contradiction itself. Terror and compassion, destruction and salvation, the one who could end the world and the one who saved it from ending. The churning continued, the treasures emerged, but the greatest emergence, the most significant production of the Samudra Manthan, was not the nectar of immortality, or the divine cow, or the wish-granting jewel. It was the revelation of Shiva's nature, the knowledge that the god who dwelt beyond the edge of order was also the god who would step forward when order itself was threatened, who would take into himself the poison that would otherwise destroy everything, the blue-throated one, Nilakantha, the one whose scar was a gift, whose discoloration was a sign of love, whose changed appearance was the evidence of sacrifice. This is who Shiva was. This is who he had always been. This is who the Vedic priests had sensed when they pleaded with Rudra to be kind, to avert his arrows, to show his auspicious face rather than his terrible one. They had known, somehow, that the god of terror was also something else, that the Howling One had another name, that the destroyer could also save. Time passed. On Kailash, Shiva and Parvati continued their eternal presence together. The poison in his throat neither killed him nor left him. It became part of who he was, a permanent reminder, a perpetual teaching, a visible lesson in what it meant to be the one who stood between the universe and its own destruction. And then another story began to unfold. Another dimension of Shiva's nature required expression. Another aspect of his cosmic function demanded mythological form. This was the story of the dance, the Ananda Tandava, the dance of bliss that was also the dance of annihilation, the movement that contained all movement, the rhythm that was the heartbeat of existence itself. This story takes us to a forest, not the mountains where Shiva dwelt, not the cosmic ocean where he drank the poison, but a forest called Tilai, later known as Chidambaram, where a community of sages had established their hermitage. These were powerful rishis, accomplished in austerity, masters of ritual, wielders of spiritual force accumulated through lifetimes of practice. They knew the mantras, they performed the sacrifices, they maintained the fires that connected earth to heaven, that kept the cosmic machinery functioning through their ceaseless offerings. But knowledge and power had curdled into something else in these sages. Arrogance had crept into their hearts. They had come to believe, through a gradual process that perhaps they themselves did not notice, that the rituals they performed were everything, that the mantras were not prayers to the gods but forces in themselves, techniques that operated independently of any divine will. They had come to believe, in short, that they did not need God at all. This is a particular kind of spiritual error. Not atheism exactly, not a denial that gods exist, but something more subtle, a conviction that the mechanism of religion can operate without the reality behind it. that the forms of worship are sufficient without the presence being worshipped, that ritual efficacy can be divorced from relationship with the divine. The sages of Tilai performed their fire sacrifices day and night. The flames rose, the mantras were chanted, the offerings were made, but there was no humility in their practice. There was no awareness that they stood before something greater than themselves. There was only technique, only power, only the satisfaction of their own spiritual accomplishment. This could not stand. This kind of error, left uncorrected, would spread, would infect the very practice of religion, would turn worship into mere mechanics, would sever the connection between human seeking and divine presence. Something had to intervene. Someone had to reveal to these accomplished but misguided sages what they had forgotten. Shiva came to the forest. He did not come in the form they might have expected. Not as the terrifying Rudra with his bow and arrows, not as the ash-smeared ascetic of Kailash, not as the cosmic lord whose third eye could reduce worlds to cinders. He came as Bhikshatana, the beautiful mendicant, the wandering beggar who moved through the world in perfect freedom, owning nothing, needing nothing, dependent on the charity of others for his daily sustenance. This form of Shiva was naked, not clothed in animal skins, not wrapped in serpents, not covered in ash. Simply naked, the body of a god, beautiful beyond mortal beauty, radiant with a presence that could not be ignored. He carried a begging bowl. He walked with the easy grace of one who had no destination, no purpose, no agenda except presence itself, and he was not alone. Vishnu accompanied him, but not in his familiar form as the preserver, not as the four-armed deity with conch and discus and mace and lotus. Vishnu had taken the form of Mohini, the enchantress, the most beautiful woman in existence, the feminine form that Vishnu sometimes assumed when circumstances required a particular kind of divine intervention. Together, they entered the forest of Tilai. Together they approached the hermitage where the sages pursued their prideful practice, and their presence began to work on the community of rishis in ways that the sages had not anticipated and could not control. The wives of the sages saw the beautiful mendicant first. They saw his form, his grace, his unearthly attractiveness, and something stirred in them, something that their husbands' austerity had taught them to suppress, something that the rigid discipline of the hermitage had not eliminated but only buried. They felt desire. They felt the pull of beauty. They found themselves drawn toward this stranger who had walked uninvited into their world. And the sages themselves, those accomplished masters of ritual, those wielders of mantric power, they saw Mohini. They saw the woman who accompanied the mendicant, whose beauty was beyond any beauty they had ever imagined. And they felt what their wives were feeling. They felt desire rising in their disciplined hearts. They felt the certainty of their spiritual achievement beginning to crack. Shiva danced. There, in the forest clearing, before the assembled community, the naked mendicant began to move. Not yet the Ananda Tandava, not yet the full cosmic dance, but a movement, a rhythm, a glimpse of what dance could be when divinity expressed itself through motion. And as he danced, and as Mohini moved beside him, the sages and their wives found themselves losing control. The carefully maintained discipline of the hermitage dissolved. The rigid structures of purity and impurity, of proper conduct and improper attraction, began to collapse. The sages watched their wives drawn toward the mendicant. They watched themselves drawn toward Mohini. They watched their lifetime of spiritual accomplishment revealed as inadequate to the actual presence of divinity. This was the teaching. This was what they needed to understand. All their technique, all their mantric power, all their accumulated austerity, it had not protected them from the simple presence of the divine. It had not prepared them for an actual encounter with God. They had been playing at religion while avoiding the terrifying reality that religion was supposed to address. When the sages finally understood what was happening, when they recognized that they had been disrupted, humiliated, shown the limitations of their achievement, they did not respond with humility. They responded with rage. They gathered their power. They invoked the forces they had accumulated through their lifetimes of practice, and they attacked. The first weapon they conjured was a serpent, a great snake, venomous, terrible, sent writhing toward the mendicant who had disturbed their certainty. But Shiva, watching the serpent approach, showed no fear. He reached out, took the serpent and wound it around his neck as an ornament. The weapon became jewelry. The attack became adornment. The sages tried again. They summoned a tiger, a beast of destruction, meant to tear the intruder apart. But Shiva caught the tiger, killed it with a gesture, stripped its skin, and wrapped the hide around his waist. The predator became a garment. The assault became decoration. Fire came next. Sacrificial flames turned weaponized, sent roaring toward the divine mendicant. But fire was no threat to Shiva. Fire was one of his elements, one of his companions, one of the forces that attended his cosmic dance. He absorbed it into himself, held it in his palm, let it burn there as a symbol of transformation rather than destruction. And finally, the sages gathered every remaining fragment of their spiritual power and performed the most dangerous working they knew. They created a demon. They brought into being a figure called Muyalaka, known also as Apasmara, a dwarf demon who embodied everything that opposed spiritual understanding. Apasmara was ignorance itself given form, forgetfulness made flesh, the force that causes beings to lose awareness of their true nature, to forget their connection to the divine, to wander in delusion through existence after existence. This was the sage's ultimate weapon. Not a serpent, not a tiger, not fire, but ignorance itself, the fundamental enemy of all spiritual seeking, sent against the intruder who had revealed their limitations. Shiva smiled. He stepped on the demon's back. He pressed Apasmara down with his foot, immobilizing the embodiment of ignorance beneath his heel. And then he began to dance. This was the Ananda Tandava, the dance of bliss, the cosmic dance that simultaneously destroys and creates, that ends universes and begins them, that contains all rhythm, all movement, all cycles of existence within its eternal patterning. This was the dance that the sages needed to see, the dance that would show them what they had been missing, what their techniques had failed to capture, what their rituals had only gestured toward without ever touching. Shiva danced, and the universe danced with him. The rhythm of his movement was the rhythm of atoms vibrating, of stars spinning, of seasons turning, of hearts beating. Every pulse of existence was contained in that dance. Every cycle of birth and death, every alternation of creation and destruction, every breath drawn by every being, all of it was present in the Ananda Tandava. In his upper right hand, Shiva held a drum, the Damaru, whose sound was the sound of creation, the primal vibration from which all forms emerged. Each beat of that drum was a universe coming into being. Each rhythm was a pattern of existence establishing itself. The drum was creation, was the yes that the cosmos speaks to itself, was the fundamental affirmation that there will be something rather than nothing. In his upper left hand, Shiva held fire, the flame of destruction, the force that ends all things, the ultimate transformation that awaits every created form. The same fire that the sages had sent against him, now held as a symbol, now revealed as part of the dance rather than opposed to it. Destruction was not the enemy of creation, but its partner. The flame was necessary. The ending was part of the cycle. His lower right hand was raised in Abhaya Mudra, the gesture of fearlessness, the sign that says, "Do not be afraid." This hand faced outward toward all beings who watched the dance, offering them protection, offering them reassurance, promising them that the cycle of creation and destruction, terrifying as it might seem, was ultimately benevolent. There was nothing to fear. The dance continued. The one who danced would not abandon those who watched. His lower left hand pointed downward toward his raised left foot, the foot that was lifted in the air, free from the ground, liberated from the pull of earth. This was the foot of moksha, of liberation, of release from the cycle of rebirth. The hand pointing to it drew attention to the possibility of freedom, to the escape that was offered to those who could see past the wheel of existence to the stillness at its center. And beneath his right foot, pressed down, immobilized, unable to rise, Apasmara, the dwarf of ignorance, the force of forgetfulness, crushed under the dancing foot of the god, defeated not by violence but by the simple weight of divine presence, shown to be powerless against the one who knew the dance of everything. This was Nataraja. This was the form in which Shiva would be worshipped for centuries to come, the bronze image that would stand in temples across the subcontinent and eventually across the world, the visual summary of everything the mythology was trying to say. Creator and destroyer in one form, fearless one and liberator. the dancer whose dance was the universe, whose movement was all movement, whose stillness at the heart of motion was the stillness that seekers sought. The sages of Tilai saw this. They saw what they had been missing. They saw what their techniques had failed to grasp. They understood finally that religion was not a mechanism to be operated, but a relationship to be entered, that the divine was not a force to be manipulated, but a presence to be encountered, that all their power had been nothing compared to a single moment of actual worship. They fell to their knees. They prostrated themselves before the dancing god. They acknowledged what they had denied, that they needed God, that their rituals were prayers rather than techniques, that humility was the beginning rather than the enemy of spiritual accomplishment. The dance continued. It continues still. In the temple at Chidambaram, which would be built on the site of the Tilai forest, the image of Nataraja dances in the cosmic hall. The drum beats, the flame burns, the foot of liberation rises toward heaven, the foot of presence crushes ignorance into eternal submission. And those who enter, who stand before the bronze figure, who let their eyes trace the perfect balance of creation and destruction, they are seeing what the sages finally saw. They are being offered what the sages finally accepted. The chance to stop operating religion as a mechanism and to encounter it as a living presence. The invitation to watch the dance and, in watching, to understand that they too are part of it. That every movement they make, every breath they take, every heartbeat that pulses in their chest is a fragment of the Ananda Tandava, a participation in the cosmic rhythm, a small echo of the dance that Shiva dances eternally at the centre of everything. This is the visual and philosophical climax of the mythology. This is where all the threads converge: the terror of Rudra, the sacrifice of Nilakantha, the union with Parvati, the cosmic function of the destroyer, into a single image that contains multitudes. The Nataraja bronze, when you stand before it, is not merely a representation of a god. It is a diagram of existence. It is a teaching encoded in metal. It is the universe explaining itself through the form of a dancing figure, inviting you to see what has always been present, to hear the drum that has always been beating, to recognize that the dance has never stopped and that you have always been dancing in it without knowing. The fire in his hand is the fire that will end your body. The drum in his hand is the rhythm that brought your body into being. The foot that crushes ignorance is available to crush your ignorance. The foot that rises toward liberation is pointing the way you can go. There is nothing to fear. The dance continues. And the one who dances is the one who drank the poison, who bears the blue throat, who saved the universe by becoming the vessel of its destruction. This is Shiva. This is who he has always been. This is who the Vedic priests sensed when they pleaded with Rudra, who the Puranic storytellers revealed through their layered narratives, who stand still at the centre of the cosmic dance, moving and unmoving, destroying and creating, the edge of the world and the heart of the world, the terror and the comfort, the end and the beginning of everything. And yet the dance, for all its cosmic completeness, was not the end of the story. The destroyer who danced at the centre of everything was also a husband, a dweller on the mountain, a god whose mythology continued to unfold in the domestic spaces of the sacred peak. To understand Shiva fully, one must return from the temple at Chidambaram to the slopes of Kailasha, where the dancer became a father, where the union of consciousness and energy produced children who would themselves become objects of worship across the subcontinent, where the household of the gods took shape in stories that reveal as much about divine nature as any cosmic vision. Return then to the mountain. Return to Kailasha, where Shiva and Parvati dwelt together after their wedding at Triyuginarayan, where the god who had renounced everything had accepted everything, where the ascetic had become a householder without ceasing to be an ascetic. Picture the sacred peak wreathed in eternal snow, its slopes descending into forests of pine and rhododendron, its summit piercing the heavens where the stars wheeled in their courses. Here, in a palace that was sometimes a cave and sometimes a structure of crystal and gold, depending on which text you trust, depending on which storyteller shaped the vision, the divine couple made their home. But even in paradise there were absences. Shiva wandered. This was his nature, as essential to him as the third eye on his forehead or the serpent coiled around his neck. He roamed the cremation grounds where the fires of death burned. He travelled to forests where sages performed their austerities. He moved through the three worlds as one who belonged everywhere and nowhere, attached to nothing, present to everything, And during these wanderings, Parvati remained on Kailasha, the goddess who had performed such severe tapas to win her husband, now dwelling in a home where that husband was often absent. The sources differ on the details of what happened next, as they differ on so many details in a mythology preserved across centuries by countless voices. But the core narrative, the shape of the story that emerged in the later Puranas from approximately the 7th century onward, tells of a moment when Parvati desired privacy. She wished to bathe undisturbed. This seems a simple desire, almost too human for a goddess who contained within herself the creative power of the universe. But the mythology of Shiva and Parvati consistently renders the cosmic through the domestic, finding in the ordinary details of household life the patterns that govern existence itself. Parvati looked at the paste upon her body, the turmeric and oils that women of the subcontinent have used for centuries to cleanse and beautify their skin. In this substance, this ordinary element of bodily care, she saw potential. She was Shakti, after all. She was the energy that animated all things, the creative force that Shiva's consciousness required to manifest anything at all. And in this moment, alone on the mountain with her husband wandering distant realms, she chose to create. She gathered the paste from her own body. She shaped it with her hands, forming limbs and torso, head and features. She made a boy, a beautiful child, perfect in every proportion, with a face of innocence and eyes that would soon open upon a world he had never seen. And then, because she was the goddess who breathes life into all things, she breathed life into this creation. The paste became flesh. The form became a being. The child opened his eyes and looked upon his mother for the first time. What does it mean that Parvati created a son from the substance of her own body without any contribution from her divine husband? The theological implications are significant and were not lost on the composers of the Puranas. Here was a child born entirely of maternal power, entirely of Shakti, entirely of the creative feminine principle that exists in partnership with, but also independent of the masculine consciousness that Shiva represents. This was Parvati's son, in a way that no ordinary child belongs to any parent, made from her body, animated by her breath, owing nothing of his existence to anyone else. She looked at this child, this son who was hers alone, and she named him and claimed him and declared him her loyal servant and protector. Then she gave him his first task, the duty that would shape everything that followed. She placed him at her door. She commanded him to guard against all intruders. She wished to bathe, and he was to ensure that she bathed undisturbed. No one at all was to pass until she permitted it. The boy took up his position. Picture him there at the entrance to Parvati's chamber, young and fierce and absolute in his loyalty. He did not know who might come. He did not know what forces might test him. He knew only that his mother had commanded him to guard this threshold, and guard it he would, against anything or anyone. Shiva returned from his wandering. The great god approached his own home, moving through the familiar landscape of Kailasha, returning to the wife who waited within. He had been absent, and the sources do not specify for how long, roaming the worlds as was his nature, and now he came back to the mountain that was his dwelling place, to the consort who was his other half. He came to the door of his own chamber, his own home, and found a boy he had never seen blocking his path. Consider the collision that was about to occur. On one side, Shiva, the lord of the universe, the dancer whose dance is all existence, the god who had drunk the poison that would have destroyed everything, who had unmade Daksha's sacrifice with a glance, whose third eye could reduce worlds to ash. On the other side, a boy who had existed for mere hours, who knew nothing of the cosmos or its lord, who knew only that he had been placed at this door by his mother and commanded to let no one pass. Shiva demanded entry. This was his home. This was his consort's chamber. What child was this who dared to block the path of the god of gods? The boy refused. He had been commanded to let no one pass. He did not know this wild-looking figure with his matted hair and his ash-smeared skin, his serpent necklace and his tiger hide. He knew only his duty and his loyalty, and neither would bend before any stranger, however terrible his appearance. The situation escalated with the terrible swiftness that characterizes so many moments in the Puranas. Shiva's Ganas, the wild host that attended him, the ghost beings and spirit warriors who served as his retinue, engaged the unknown boy in combat, and the child who had been made from turmeric paste, who had existed for only hours, fought them. He fought them and held his ground. The Ganas could not move him from that threshold. The loyalty that Parvati had breathed into him along with life itself proved stronger than the divine armies sent against him. What happened next is told with unflinching clarity in the Shiva Purana. The great god himself, in fury at this sustained defiance, in rage at being blocked from his own home by an unknown child who would not yield, struck with divine force. The head of the boy was severed from his body. The child who had been created to guard a door lay dead upon the threshold he had refused to abandon. Parvati emerged. She saw her son, her creation, her breath-animated child, her loyal guardian, dead upon the ground, and the goddess who contained within herself the power that makes stars burn and planets spin, who was Shakti itself in mortal form, who had once been Sati and had died in fire rather than hear her husband insulted. This goddess looked upon what had been done, and her grief transformed into something far more terrible than grief. She raged. The texts describe her fury in cosmic terms because domestic terms would be inadequate. She was not merely angry. She was the annihilating force that lies coiled at the heart of creation, the destructive potential that balances every creative act. Her power began to unmake things. Storms gathered that were not weather but divine wrath given form. The earth trembled not from geological forces but from the footsteps of a mother's vengeance. The cosmos itself, the ordered universe that the gods maintained through their cooperation, began to destabilize under the pressure of Parvati's grief. The gods gathered. They always gather when catastrophe threatens. Brahma and Vishnu, Indra and the heavenly host, all the powers that maintain the cycles of existence. They looked at what was happening and understood that this was not a situation that could be resolved through combat or diplomacy in any ordinary sense. Parvati's fury was not an enemy to be defeated. It was a cosmic force that, if not addressed at its source, would simply continue to unravel everything until nothing remained to be unraveled. Brahma intervened with Shiva. The creator god, understanding what was at stake, helped the destroyer understand what he had done. This was not some intruder, some enemy, some demon taking the form of a child. This was Parvati's son, created from her own body, animated by her own breath, loyal unto death to the mother who had made him. Shiva had killed his own stepson without ever knowing who the boy was. He had destroyed something that Parvati had created, something that was hers in a way that nothing else could be, and no amount of divine supremacy could undo the simple fact of what had occurred. Shiva understood. The god who contained within himself the potential for both destruction and restoration, who was simultaneously the force that ended things and the force that allowed new things to begin, recognized that he must act to repair what he had broken. He agreed to restore the boy to life, but the head, the original head, the head that Parvati had shaped from the turmeric paste of her own body, was gone. To restore the child, a new head would be needed. Brahma was dispatched to find one. The instructions were specific. He was to bring the head of the first creature he found sleeping with its head pointed north. This detail appears consistently across the sources. The northern orientation, the sleeping creature, the first one found. Brahma travelled until he came upon an elephant in just such a position, its great head pointing toward the pole star, its body at rest in the deep sleep of beasts. He took what was needed and returned to Kailasha. The elephant's head was placed upon the boy's body. Shiva breathed new life into the restored form. The god whose wife had first animated this child now contributing his own animating breath to its resurrection. The boy opened his eyes for the second time, and this time the face that looked upon the world was different. The eyes were an elephant's eyes, patient and wise. The ears were an elephant's ears, vast and receptive. The trunk curved down where a human nose had been, and the single tusk gleamed in the light of the sacred mountain. Shiva looked upon this being, this child who had died defending his mother's threshold, who had been unmade by divine fury and remade by divine penitence, whose form now combined the earthly substance of his mother's body with the wisdom-bearing head of the elephant. And Shiva declared this child not merely restored, but elevated. He named him Ganapati, Lord of the Ganas, the leader of Shiva's own retinue, the chief of the very forces that had first tried to remove him from that threshold. The boy who had fought Shiva's armies now commanded them. This is Ganesha as he enters the Hindu imagination, the elephant-headed god, the son of Parvati, the remover of obstacles who was himself the greatest obstacle, defeated and restored and transformed into something that transcended what he had been before. His worship would spread across the subcontinent and beyond. His image would be placed at doorways, and the same doorways he had once died defending, because he who understood threshold guardianship better than anyone was the perfect protector of thresholds. He would be invoked at the beginning of all ventures, all journeys, all undertakings, because the obstacle remover must be honoured before obstacles can be encountered. But consider the deeper pattern at work in this mythology. Parvati created, Shiva destroyed. Parvati's grief-forced restoration. The child who emerged combined elements of both divine parents, made from his mother's body, revived by his father's breath, transformed through a process of death and rebirth that echoes the cosmic cycles Shiva himself governs. Ganesha is the reconciliation of creation and destruction, the proof that even the most terrible destruction can be followed by restoration, the living embodiment of the truth that Shiva is not only the ender of things, but the one who makes new beginnings possible. He is also something else, the patron of arts and sciences, the god of intellect and wisdom, the deity to whom scholars and artists offer their prayers before beginning their work. The elephant head, in Hindu symbolism, represents exactly these qualities: the vast memory, the patient intelligence, the capacity for both gentleness and power that elephants embody in the consciousness of the subcontinent. Ganesha thinks before he acts, he understands before he intervenes. He removes obstacles not through brute force but through wisdom, finding the path around difficulties rather than simply smashing through them. And so the household of Kailasha now contained a child. The ascetic who had become a householder was now also a father, though not in the ordinary sense. Ganesha was Parvati's son, made from her body alone, adopted and transformed by Shiva through death and resurrection. The family was taking shape. The mountain was becoming more than a dwelling place of divine adults. It was becoming a home in which childhood and parenthood, the ordinary relationships of mortal life, were enacted by the gods themselves. But Ganesha was not the only child who would join this household. The demon Tarakasura still tyrannized the three worlds, still ruled from his conquered throne, with the confidence of one who had been promised that only a son of Shiva could end him. And while Ganesha was now Shiva's son in some sense, through adoption, through resurrection, through the breath that had restored him, he was not the son whose birth had been necessary to fulfill the conditions of Taraka's defeat. That child, the warrior who would lead the gods' armies against their demon oppressor, would come into being through a different process entirely. The stories of Kartikeya's origin are more various than those of Ganesha, reflecting the complex process by which different regional traditions were woven together into the Puranic synthesis. But the broad outlines are clear, and they tell of a birth that involved not one parent or two, but a whole network of divine beings, each contributing something essential to the creation of the god of war. Shiva and Parvati were united on Kailasha. The wedding had been performed at Triyuginarayan, the marriage had been consummated, the divine pair dwelt together in the intimacy that gods are capable of. But the seed that would become Kartikeya did not pass directly from father to mother in the ordinary fashion of mortal conception. According to the Skanda Purana, Agni, the god of fire who had been witness to all the sacrifices offered since the Vedic age, who was the mouth of the gods through which all offerings passed, carried Shiva's creative essence away from that union. The sacred fire bore what was too powerful for mortal or even ordinary divine vessels to contain. Agni carried this essence until he could carry it no more, until the fire itself was overwhelmed by what it held. He released it into the waters of the Ganga, the great river goddess who flows through the heavens and the earth, whose waters purify all they touch. And Ganga received this essence and bore it within her sacred flow until she too released it, depositing fiery sparks among the reeds at the water's edge. In that reed forest, on the banks of the holy river, the child took form. But this was not an ordinary child, not even by the standards of divine births. He manifested with 6 heads and 12 arms, a being of such overwhelming martial power that his very form declared his purpose. The stars themselves participated in his nurturing. The 6 Kritikas, the constellation known to the west as the Pleiades, descended to care for him, each of the 6 mothers nursing one of his 6 faces. From these celestial nurses he received his most common name, Kartikeya, son of the Kritikas, child of the stars. The tradition is not unanimous about which son is elder. Some texts, including portions of the Shiva Purana itself, depict Kartikeya as the firstborn, the son whose birth was prophesied as the necessary condition for Taraka's defeat, the child who existed before Parvati ever shaped Ganesha from her bath paste. Other traditions, other Puranas, other regional telling reverse the order or leave it ambiguous. What matters is that both sons existed, that the household of Kailasha included these two divine children who would become objects of worship across the subcontinent, and that together they represented the complete spectrum of Shiva's protective function. Kartikeya grew with divine swiftness, the child of fire and water nursed by stars, nurtured by the combined powers of multiple divine beings, came rapidly into the fullness of his strength. His purpose had been ordained before his birth. He existed to destroy Tarakasura, to end the tyranny that had oppressed the three worlds since Shiva's withdrawal into meditation, to fulfill the conditions that Brahma had established when the demon had been granted his boon of near invincibility. The gods appointed him commander of their celestial armies. This was Skanda, the war god, the general whose 6 faces could watch in all directions simultaneously, whose 12 arms could wield weapons beyond the capacity of any ordinary being to hold. The hosts of heaven gathered under his leadership, the devas who had been driven from their domains, the celestial warriors who had been helpless against Taraka's power, all the forces that had been unable to challenge the demon who could only be killed by a son of Shiva. And Parvati, the mother who had waited and performed tapas and been married specifically so that this moment could occur, gave her son the weapon that would prove decisive, the Vel, the divine spear that would become Kartikeya's signature armament, that would be depicted in countless images of him across South India especially, where his worship under the name Murugan would become particularly intense, passed from mother to son. It was not merely a weapon, but a concentrated expression of Shakti itself, the goddess's power given material form as an instrument of destruction. The war that followed was the cosmic conflict that 3 worlds had awaited. Tarakasura and his brothers, the demons who had seemed invincible, who had conquered heaven and oppressed earth, who had ruled with the confidence of those protected by divine boons, found themselves facing an opponent against whom their protections were useless. Kartikeya was exactly what Taraka had been promised as his only possible destroyer, a son of Shiva, born specifically to fulfill this function, armed with divine weapons, commanding the assembled might of heaven. The battles raged across the cosmic landscape. The texts describe conflicts of such scale that mortal warfare seems trivial by comparison. Armies of demons against armies of gods, weapons that could shatter mountains, powers that could reshape the fabric of reality. But throughout it all, the outcome was foreordained by the very boon that Taraka had sought for protection. He had asked that only a son of Shiva could kill him. He had gotten his wish, and now Shiva's son had come, and the boon that had seemed to guarantee Taraka's eternal safety became instead the instrument of his inevitable destruction. The moment came. Kartikeya faced Tarakasura directly, the 6-headed god of war against the demon who had terrorized the universe. The Vel in Kartikeya's hand, his mother's gift, the spear of concentrated Shakti, flew swift and true. With one precise motion, it struck Tarakasura's chest. It pierced the protection that had seemed impenetrable, neutralized the boon that had seemed to guarantee safety, ended the tyrant who had seemed unendable. The 3 worlds were liberated. The gods returned to heaven, no longer exiles. The order that Shiva's withdrawal had allowed to collapse was restored through the action of Shiva's son. And Kartikeya took his place in the cosmic hierarchy as the defender of Dharma, the warrior who protects sacred law against those who would destroy it, the general who leads heaven's armies whenever demonic forces threaten to overwhelm the order of existence. Consider now the 2 sons together. Ganesha, born from his mother's body alone, killed by his father in ignorance and restored with an elephant's head, became the remover of inner obstacles, the god who helps devotees clear the barriers within themselves, the patron of wisdom and arts and sciences, the deity who thinks around problems rather than simply attacking them. Kartikeya, born from his father's essence through fire and water and starlight, came into being specifically for warfare, for the external battle against demonic forces that threaten cosmic order. Together, they represent the complete protective function. The obstacles to spiritual progress are both internal and external. We struggle against our own ignorance, our own limitations, our own failure to understand. And for this, Ganesha. We also face forces beyond ourselves, circumstances and powers that oppose our flourishing, enemies in whatever form enemies take, and for this, Kartikeya. The sons of Shiva are not redundant, they are complementary, covering between them the full spectrum of what threatens and what protects. The household of Kailasha was now complete. Shiva and Parvati, consciousness and energy united in divine marriage. Ganesha and Kartikeya, the remover of inner obstacles and the destroyer of outer enemies. The family that had formed through cosmic tragedy, Sati's death, Parvati's tapas, the wedding at Triyuganarayan, now included children whose worship would spread across the subcontinent, whose images would fill temples from the Himalayas to the southern seas, whose names would be spoken in prayers by millions of devotees across thousands of years. But mythology does not remain at the level of family narrative forever. The domestic details of Kailasha exist within a larger frame, a cosmic structure that gives those details their ultimate significance. To understand what Shiva truly is, what he has always been beneath and beyond the stories of wife and children and household, we must step back to consider his place within the great architecture of Hindu theology, his role within the Trimurti that governs the fundamental functions of existence: creation, preservation, destruction. These are the three cosmic operations, the three great functions that keep the universe moving through its cycles. And in the theological synthesis that emerged through the Puranic period, these three functions were assigned to three gods: Brahma the creator, Vishnu the preserver, Shiva the destroyer. The Trimurti, the three forms, the triple godhead, became one of the organizing principles of Hindu religious thought, a way of understanding how the cosmos maintains itself through the interplay of these complementary forces. But, and this is crucial, the Shaiva tradition does not accept that Shiva is merely one-third of this arrangement. The Shiva Purana and the Linga Purana tell a story that reveals what Shaiva theologians understand to be the true relationship between Shiva and the other members of the supposed Trinity. In the beginning, or rather, in that time before time when the cosmos was being established, Brahma and Vishnu encountered each other. The creator and the preserver, each supreme in his own function, each possessing power beyond mortal comprehension, found themselves in dispute. Who was greater? Who was more fundamental? Whose function was more essential to the existence of all things? They argued. Gods argue as mortals argue, though on a vaster scale. Brahma claimed primacy because creation must precede all other functions. Nothing can be preserved or destroyed until it has first been brought into being. Vishnu countered that preservation was more fundamental, that creation without preservation would be meaningless, that the sustaining of existence was the ground upon which all other functions depended. Neither would yield. The debate continued until it became clear that argument alone could not resolve the question. Some demonstration was needed, some revelation that would settle the matter beyond further dispute. And then, suddenly, absolutely, with no warning and no explanation, a pillar of light appeared between them, a column of fire stretching infinitely in both directions, beyond sight, beyond comprehension, blazing with a radiance that made the light of creation itself seem dim by comparison. The Jyotirlinga, the pillar of radiance, erupted into being, and Brahma and Vishnu found their arguments suddenly irrelevant in the face of this overwhelming manifestation. They decided to investigate. Brahma took the form of a swan, the hamsa that would become his vehicle in later iconography, and flew upward, seeking the top of the pillar. Vishnu assumed his Varaha avatar, the great boar, and dove downward, seeking the pillar's base. Each travelled for unimaginable distances, through eternities of space and time, searching for an end to the infinite light. Vishnu returned first. He had travelled farther than any being could measure, through depths of existence that had no name, and he had found nothing. The pillar continued below him, always below him, without any end he could discover. He admitted this honestly. The preserver, who maintained cosmic truth as part of his fundamental function, acknowledged that he had failed to find the limit of the light. Brahma also returned. He too had travelled impossibly far, through heights beyond imagination, and he too had found no end to the pillar. But Brahma did not admit this. Instead, he claimed that he had reached the top, that he knew where the pillar ended, that his journey had been successful where Vishnu's had failed. As proof, he produced a Ketaki flower, a bloom he claimed had been at the pillar's summit, a witness to his supposed success. The lie was detected. The flower perhaps confessed. The truth somehow emerged. Brahma had not found the top of the pillar. He had falsely claimed success where he had actually failed, had used deception to claim supremacy in a contest he had not won. Shiva emerged from the pillar. The infinite light resolved itself into the form of the god, the same god who had been Rudra in the Rigveda, who had drunk the halahala poison, who had danced the Ananda Tandava in the forest of Tilai. He looked upon Brahma and Vishnu, the creator and the preserver who had been arguing about supremacy, and he rendered judgment. Vishnu, who had told the truth about his failure, was honoured. He would be worshipped throughout the three worlds, his temples would be filled with devotees, his names would be spoken in prayers for as long as prayers were spoken. His honesty had demonstrated his worthiness to receive such veneration. Brahma, who had lied, was cursed. He would not be worshipped, or at least he would have only a single temple, a notably minimal presence for a god of his cosmic function. His dishonesty had disqualified him from the reverence that would otherwise have been his due. But the deeper meaning of the story lies not in the rewards and punishments, but in what the pillar itself revealed. Shiva was not one god among three, one function among three, 1/3 of a committee governing existence. Shiva was the pillar, the infinite light that Brahma and Vishnu could not measure, the absolute that underlay and exceeded both creation and preservation, the ground of being that made all other functions possible. From the Shiva theological perspective, the Trimurti is not a partnership of equals, but a form of Shiva himself. As Brahma, or through his aspect known as Sadyajata, Shiva creates. As Vishnu, or through his aspect known as Vamadeva, Shiva preserves. As Rudra, or through his aspect known as Agora, Shiva dissolves. The three cosmic functions are not distributed among three separate beings. They are the three faces of a single reality, three modes of a single god's activity. This means that destruction, Shiva's most famous function, is not separate from or opposed to creation and preservation. It is part of the same movement, the same rhythm, the same cosmic dance that we saw in the Nataraja form. Things are created. They are maintained for a time. They are dissolved so that new things can be created. The cycle continues eternally, and Shiva is the one who turns the wheel, who beats the drum, who dances the dance that makes all of it happen. The destroyer, then, is not an enemy of existence, but its deepest friend. Without dissolution, creation would choke on its own products. Without death, life would become a prison. Without endings, beginnings would become impossible. Shiva's destructive function is not the opposite of the creative and preservative functions. It is their necessary completion, the third movement without which the other two could not continue. This is the theological vision toward which all the mythology has been building. Rudra at the edge of the Vedic world, the howling terror that could wound and heal. The consort of Sati and Parvati, the husband who contains within himself the transcendence that his wives must reach toward. The blue-throated one who drank the poison, the dancer who crushes ignorance, the father of the obstacle remover and the war god. All of these are aspects, manifestations, faces of the infinite pillar of light that Brahma and Vishnu could not measure, the Jyotirlinga, the absolute reality, the ground of being that takes form after form in order to make itself accessible to those who seek it. The temple at Chidambaram houses the dancing Nataraja, but across India, the Jyotirlingas themselves are worshipped. 12 sacred sites where the infinite pillar is believed to have manifested, where devotees come to encounter not an image or a representation but the actual presence of the Absolute. Somnath and Mallikarjuna, Mahakaleshwar and Omkareshwar, the scattered geography of a theology written upon the land itself. Each of these sites claims to be a place where the light broke through, where the pillar that Brahma and Vishnu could not measure touched the earth in a form that human beings could approach. The story is not finished. There are still depths to explore, still dimensions of Shiva's nature that we have not yet examined. But here, at the threshold between the mythological and the philosophical, between the narrative cycles and the theological frameworks, let the image of that infinite pillar rest in the imagination. Let the mystery of the Jyotirlinga stand as a gateway to what comes next. For if the Jyotirlinga is the gateway, then what lies beyond it is not another story, but the dissolution of story itself. The recognition that every myth, every narrative, every tale of Sati's fire and Parvati's tapas, of poison swallowed and demons destroyed, of sons born and wars won, has been pointing towards something that cannot finally be told. It can only be recognized, and it is to this recognition that the tradition ultimately leads. In the Kashmir Valley, sometime around the 9th century of the Common Era, a scholar named Vasugupta slept on a mountainside and dreamed of the god himself. In the dream, Shiva spoke to him, not through thunder or cosmic manifestation, but through simple instruction. "Go to the rock," the god said. "Find what is written there." When Vasugupta woke, he climbed to the place the dream had indicated and found a boulder. And on that boulder, or beneath it, or within it, the accounts vary, he discovered 77 aphorisms inscribed in the stone itself, the Shiva Sutras, the seed text of a philosophical revolution that would reframe everything the mythology had been saying, translating the language of gods and demons into the language of consciousness itself. The tradition that grew from Vasugupta's discovery is called Trika, a word meaning threefold, referring to its analysis of reality into three fundamental categories: Shiva, the absolute consciousness; Shakti, the self-reflective capacity of that consciousness; and Nara, the human being who is, whether they know it or not, identical with both. This is not theology as the West typically understands theology, not a system of beliefs about a god who exists somewhere outside the believer. This is a map of the interior, a phenomenology of awareness, a set of instructions for recognizing what has always already been the case. The sutras themselves are dense, almost impossibly compressed. Each one requires unpacking, expansion, commentary to release its meaning. Fortunately, the tradition did not lack for commentators. Through the centuries that followed, a lineage of scholars and practitioners elaborated the insights encoded in those 77 aphorisms into a complete philosophical system of remarkable sophistication. Among them was Abhinavagupta, perhaps the greatest polymath Kashmir ever produced, aesthetician, philosopher, tantric master, whose work synthesized centuries of preceding thought into comprehensive treatises that would influence Indian philosophy for the next millennium. But it is Abhinavagupta's student Kshemaraja, whose work brings the teachings into sharpest focus for those seeking not merely to understand but to practice. His commentary on the Shiva Sutras, the Vimochini, remains the most celebrated interpretation of the root text, studied and revered across centuries. And his own independent work, the Pratyabhijnahridayam, sometimes called the Recognition Sutras, distills the entire philosophy into 20 concise statements that function as both doctrine and instruction manual: recognition, pratyabhijna. The word itself contains the key, not acquisition of something new, but recognition of something that was never absent. What, then, does the practitioner recognize? The answer is at once utterly simple and cosmically vast. They recognize that the consciousness they experience as their own intimate awareness is not different from the consciousness that is Shiva himself, not similar to, not a fragment of, not connected to, identical with. The light by which you read these words, the awareness in which these sounds arise, the knowing that knows the knowing, this is not a gift from God, not a spark of divinity granted to otherwise inert matter. This is Shiva. There is nothing else for it to be. In the technical language of the tradition, Shiva is called Prakasha, pure light, luminosity itself, the fundamental capacity for anything whatsoever to appear or be known. But light that only illuminates without knowing itself illuminates nothing in particular, means nothing, goes nowhere. And so Shakti is called Vimarsha, the self-reflective capacity, the turn by which awareness becomes aware of itself, the vibrational pulse through which the static light becomes dynamic knowing. Prakasha and Vimarsha, Shiva and Shakti, light and its self-recognition, consciousness and its inherent capacity to know. These are not two things but two aspects of a single reality, distinguishable in analysis but never actually separate. You cannot have light that does not illuminate. You cannot have illumination without light. You cannot have awareness that is not aware of something. You cannot have that of which it is aware without the awareness that knows it. And here is the extraordinary claim. This single reality, this Prakasha Vimarsha, this Shiva Shakti, is not merely what underlies the universe. It is what actively becomes the universe, through its own free creative power, without ever ceasing to be itself. The mountains and rivers, the stars and planets, the bodies of creatures and the thoughts that arise within them. All of this is consciousness in the process of knowing itself through infinite forms. The dance of Nataraja, seen from this perspective, is not a mythological event that happened once in a forest called Tilai. It is happening now, as the reading of these words, as the hearing of these sounds, as the arising and dissolving of each moment of experience. You are not watching the cosmic dance. You are the cosmic dance dancing. This means that all the mythology, every story told across these hours, functions not as history, but as revelation. The marriage of Shiva and Parvati is the recognition that consciousness and energy were never separate. The destruction of Daksha's sacrifice is the shattering of rigid structures that have forgotten their living source. The swallowing of the halahala is the capacity of awareness to include even poison, even suffering, even death, without being destroyed by what it includes. Ganesha guarding the door is the threshold of recognition that must be crossed before the inner chamber can be entered. Kartikeya defeating Taraka is the triumph of focused awareness over the demons of ignorance and distraction. The Jyotirlinga is the absolute shining through every form, unmeasurable by the limited instruments of ego and acquisition. From this philosophical vantage, the entire tradition becomes a technology of recognition. Practice is designed not to create something new, but to dissolve the obscurations that prevent seeing what is already and always the case. And those practices have never been abstract, never merely intellectual. They have been embodied, sensory, visceral. The ash smeared on the forehead and the body, the bilva leaves placed on the linga. The abhisheka, the ceremonial bathing, in which water and milk and honey flow over the stone that represents the unrepresentable. Consider the ash. Called basma, or vibhuti, sacred ash has been applied to the bodies of Shiva devotees for millennia. The most charged form of this ash comes from cremation grounds. The literal remains of human bodies consumed by fire, the physical substance of what was once a living being reduced to its elemental residue. To smear this ash upon the forehead, the arms, the chest, is to wear death. Not as morbidity, not as fascination with the macabre, but as recognition. The body that wears the ash will itself become ash. The one who applies the sacred substance is already, from the perspective of time, identical with the substance being applied. The gesture collapses the distance between the living and the dead, the worshipper and the worshipped, the one who makes offerings and the one to whom offerings are made. In the moment of applying basma, the devotee touches, literally physically, the truth that Shiva embodies. That form is temporary, that dissolution is certain, that what remains when all that can burn has burned is precisely what was present before anything appeared to burn. The bilva leaf functions differently but toward the same recognition. Sacred to Shiva from antiquity, its trifoliate structure, 3 leaves emerging from a single stem, represents countless trinities within the tradition. The 3 gunas or qualities of nature, sattva, rajas, tamas, the 3 states of consciousness, waking, dreaming, deep sleep. The 3 cosmic functions, creation, preservation, dissolution, but also and always. The 3 that are one, the multiplicity that never departs from unity, the diversity of manifestation that remains always the self-expression of a single reality. To offer bilva leaves upon the linga is to offer the recognition that multiplicity and unity are not opposed. The 3 leaves are one offering. The countless beings are one consciousness. The devotee and the deity are one awareness wearing the temporary costume of separation. And the abhisheka, the bathing, the anointing, the continuous pouring over the stone, water from sacred rivers, milk still warm from the cow, honey thick and golden, sandalwood paste, rose water, substance after substance flowing over the surface of the linga, never remaining, always running off, always replenished from the vessel held in the priest's or devotee's hands. The ritual enacts the nature of time itself, the ceaseless flow of moments over the unchanging presence that witnesses them. The linga does not move. The linga does not grasp at what flows over it, does not resist the passage, does not prefer honey to water or water to milk. It simply remains, the stable centre around which impermanence does its dance. To pour abhisheka is to participate physically in the philosophical insight that what you are is not the flow, but the presence over which the flow moves. The thoughts, emotions, sensations, experiences that constitute the stream of personal history, These are the milk and honey running over the stone. What remains when they have passed is what was there before they arrived, the awareness that witnesses the Prakasha Vimarsha, the Shiva Shakti, the self that the tradition invites you to recognize as your own true nature. This recognition is not merely intellectual assent to a philosophical proposition, it is transformation at the root. When Kshemaraja writes that the contraction of consciousness creates the experience of being a limited individual, when the tradition speaks of the bonds or fetters that make the infinite feel finite, the unbound feel bound, the free feel trapped, it is pointing towards something experiential, something that can be directly observed in the texture of everyday awareness. Notice how attention narrows. Notice how identity contracts around a name, a history, a set of preferences and aversions. Notice how the infinite sky of awareness seems to shrink into the small room of a personal self, concerned with its particular survival, its particular pleasures, its particular fears. This contraction is not sin. It is not fall from grace. It is not cosmic mistake. It is the creative power of consciousness itself, freely choosing to experience itself as limited, so that the game of seeking and finding can be played, so that the joy of recognition can occur. The practices exist to reverse the contraction, or rather, to make conscious the expansion that was never actually lost. Meditation on the nature of awareness, mantra repetition that saturates the mind with the vibration of the divine name, pranayama that works with breath as vehicle of consciousness, visualization of the deity forms, Nataraja dancing, Dakshinamurti teaching, Ardhanarishvara uniting masculine and feminine, not as worship of something external, but as recognition of capacities already present in awareness itself. Each practice, when understood properly, is not a method for achieving something absent, but a device for noticing something present, and this brings the tradition fully alive, fully contemporary. The Shiva Sutras were inscribed, so the tradition holds, on a rock in Kashmir more than 1,000 years ago. The temples were built centuries past, the myths were composed in eras that left no certain dates, but recognition has no date. The awareness that reads these words is the same awareness that Vasugupta was pointing toward when he wrote down what he found on the mountainside. The consciousness that hears these sounds is the consciousness that dances as Nataraja, that swallowed the halahala, that manifested as infinite pillar between Brahma and Vishnu. To recognize this is not to believe something old. It is to know something timeless, to see that the light by which anything is seen is the light the tradition calls Shiva, and that this light is not other than what you most intimately are. Today, this recognition is sought by more than 1 billion people across the planet, in temples and home shrines, in caves and cremation grounds, in the sophisticated philosophical centres of the remaining traditional schools, and in the living rooms of suburban practitioners whose ancestors came from Punjab or Tamil Nadu or Gujarat. The tradition has never been more geographically dispersed, never touched more diverse human lives, and at its heart, whether the practitioner understands the full philosophical architecture or simply offers flowers to the linga in their village temple, beats the same pulse: recognition that the divine is not far, not separate, not achieved through elaborate effort, but is the very awareness in which all effort arises. And of all the places where this recognition is enacted, where the mythology and philosophy and practice converge into a single unbroken ritual, one stands apart. In the ancient city of Ujjain, on the banks of the Shipra River, the Mahakaleshwar temple has maintained its vigil for centuries. Here the deity faces south, unique among the Jyotirlingas, the direction of death, the direction of Yama, the direction from which time itself is said to flow. Mahakal, the great time, the Lord who devours all that exists within time because he himself is time, and is also that which transcends time, the eternal witness before whom centuries pass like the Abhisheka flowing over stone. Every morning, every single morning, without recorded interruption, for longer than anyone can remember, the Bhasma Arati begins in the hours before dawn. The narrow lanes around the temple are already stirring by 2:30 in the morning. Small tea shops open with single gas flames, pots of chai sending steam into the darkness. Pilgrims who have travelled from across the subcontinent and beyond emerge from their lodgings, making their way through streets still cool with night. The doors of the inner sanctum open at 4 o'clock, the oil lamps are lit, and the chanting begins, Om Namah Shivaya, Har Har Mahadev, the ancient syllables that have been pronounced in this place since the temple's founding in the 8th century, and that echo syllables pronounced 3,000 years ago on the Gangetic plains. But here is what makes this particular ritual unique. The ash used to anoint the deity is not symbolic ash, not commercially prepared powder, not sacred in theory only. It is actual basma from actual cremation pyres. Each morning, ash from the burning grounds is brought into the sanctum and applied to the face and body of the Mahakal Linga, while the flames flicker and the voices chant and the devotees press as close as they can to witness what is happening. The god who destroys is anointed with destruction itself. The Lord of Time wears time's signature substance, the residue of what time has already claimed, and those who watch, those who participate, those who receive on their own foreheads the same ash that has touched the linga are being initiated into the same recognition, that what burns is not what they are, that what remains is not ashes but awareness, that the terror at the edge of existence, the terror the Rigvedic priests were trying to keep at bay, is not other than the blessing at existence's core. The ritual ends as dawn begins to break over the Shipra. The devotees emerge into streets now filling with morning light, ash on their foreheads, the syllables still vibrating in their bodies. Another day begins, another turn of the wheel that Shiva turns, another iteration of the dance that has never stopped and will never stop. The Ananda Tandava continuing in every heartbeat and every breath, in every galaxy spinning and every atom vibrating, in every birth and every death and every moment between. 3,000 years ago on the Gangetic plains, a priest sat before a fire and spoke words into the darkness. Rudra, the howl, the terrifying one, the one whose arrows bring fever and sudden death, whose presence makes the cattle sicken, whose attention no sensible being would wish to attract. And in the same breath, because it was always in the same breath, the Blessed One, Shiva, the auspicious, the one who heals what he wounds, who blesses what he destroys, who renews what he dissolves. Keep your arrows away from us, the priest begged. Let them fall on someone else, and yet come close. Do not pass us by. We need you, even though we fear you. We need the very thing that terrifies us. That prayer was the seed. Everything that followed, Sati's fire and Parvati's tapas, the halahala burning blue in the divine throat, the cosmic dance and the elephant-headed sun and the infinite pillar of light, all of it grew from that first terrified, reverent, paradoxical invocation of the one who cannot be safely ignored and cannot be safely approached. For 3 millennia, the tradition has been elaborating that seed, unfolding its implications, translating its terror and its blessing into forms that each generation could approach. And still, this morning in Ujjain, the ash was applied, and the lamps were lit, and the syllables were chanted, continuing a conversation that has no recorded beginning and shows no sign of ending. What are we to make of it? What does it mean that the oldest continuous tradition of worship we can trace leads not to a god of comfort, not to a cosmic protector who makes the darkness go away, but to this, to Rudra, to Mahakal, to the one who dances on ignorance while holding fire in his hand? Perhaps it means that the human beings who began this conversation understood something we are still struggling to grasp, that the edge is not other than the centre, that what we most fear is not separate from what most deeply sustains us, that the fire consumes and the fire illuminates and the fire is not 2 fires but one, that Shiva is terrible precisely because Shiva is true and the truth cannot be made comfortable, and comfort was never what we most needed anyway. The dance continues. Apasmara still struggles beneath the lifted foot, unable to be destroyed because ignorance is part of the pattern, because the forgetting is what makes the remembering possible, because Shiva does not wish to dance on an empty stage. The drum still beats. Creation, preservation, dissolution, in rhythm, in time, in the eternal now that contains all times. The fire still burns in the palm of the upraised hand, illuminating the face that smiles even as it destroys, the face that offers fear and freedom in the same gesture, the face that has been seeking you since before you were born, since before the stars were kindled, since before anything existed to be afraid. Go to the temple at Ujjain, if you can, in the hours before dawn, or go to Chidambaram, where Nataraja dances still, or go nowhere but inward, to the space where the tradition insists the same truth waits, the awareness aware of itself, the light that never goes out, the Prakasha Vimarsha, Shiva Shakti, not two, not one, beyond the categories that thought creates. The ash is on your forehead already, even if no priest has applied it. The mantra is already sounding in the space before thought arises. The dance is already dancing you into existence and out again, each breath a creation, each exhalation a dissolution, each pause between them the stillness at the center of the storm. If the one who destroys is also the one who dances and the dance never stops, what exactly are we afraid of? The chanting continues in Ujjain. The flame flickers over the south-facing linga, the ashes applied, and the god who was howling at the edge of the Vedic world, the god who burned Kama to ash with the fire of his third eye, the god who holds the crescent moon and the flowing Ganga in his matted locks, the god who is terror and blessing and both at once, that God is still waiting. Not in the temple, not in the sky, not in some realm accessible only to the perfected or the pure, here, now, in the awareness that knows these words are being heard. Om Namah Shivaya.